Hollow Knight released in February of 2017, and I first played it later that year before either of the major DLC packs came out. I beat it and I got the bad ending, and while I could tell there was more to it if I kept going, I was satisfied with the amount of game I'd got out of it and I didn't go back to finish the rest. I remember really enjoying the game, although the bits that stick out the most in my memory of that first playthrough are the parts that gave me trouble, that I had to try over and over again before finally completing. The boss fights against Soul Master, Lost Kin, and the third and final challenge in the Colosseum of Fools. A year later I picked the game up again, shortly after the final DLC pack Godmaster had been released, starting a new file to go through the game again and see the new content. In the other major DLC, the Grim Troop, I travelled around the overworld to collect the flames and made it as far as the new boss added by that DLC, Grim, and I got my ass whooped, so I moved on to check out the other big chunk of new content, Godhome. I think I knew going in that it was mostly boss-focused content that would allow you to fight rematches against old bosses, with optional modifiers to spice things up, and new bosses to unlock for beating certain pantheons, boss rushes that have to be done in one sitting. But, since I had started a new file, I hadn't yet seen all the bosses in the overworld, and the pantheons weren't unlocked yet. I went down to the Hall of Gods, a room where you can select from all the bosses you've seen and fight them at 3 difficulty levels, including one where you die in 1 hit, and the thought of going back out into the overworld to play through the whole game again and unlock all the bosses, then having to come back to Godhome and fight them all again, just killed my motivation and my playthrough dead. I was still excited for the sequel, but I thought my time with Hollow Knight was over. The reason I'm telling you this is because I can imagine that this was a lot of players' initial reaction to the final DLC. You could argue that both the Grim Troop and Godmaster rely far too much on reusing content from the base game to pad out the runtimes before you get to see the truly new content at the end of the DLC packs. And while I think this is a particularly uncharitable take, especially considering that Team Cherry is only 2 guys and they release all of this for free, well, it's hard to refute. Add to this that the overwhelming majority of the content added by DLC is boss fight related, and it's easy to see how players looking forward to platforming challenges or new areas to explore could have been disappointed. And yes, I know about the Path of Pain, but come on. In the base game, beating a boss usually serves as a climactic challenge to complete an area, or unlock a new area or ability, or progress the story. Of course, there's the intrinsic satisfaction of winning a difficult fight, but also an extrinsic motivator in that you get to see more of the game after you buckle down and beat it. With the DLC bosses, that extrinsic motivator isn't really there. Incidentally, I think this is also probably why I didn't feel the need to keep playing for the true ending during that first playthrough in 2017. The extrinsic motivation offered by the game had dried up for me once I'd seen the first ending. The reason I'm telling you this is because it's a hurdle you need to cross in order to get the proper enjoyment out of this DLC. If the simple joy of playing and mastering the game isn't enough reward for you, there's sadly not much for you in this DLC content. And yes, I did just say downloadable content. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Why the hell am I making a video about this if I didn't even play it? Well, around 2 years after I'd last put down Hollow Knight, YouTube happened to recommend me the hour-long Hollow Knight lore video by Mossbag. And if that sounds like a long video to you, then I hope you haven't noticed the length of this one yet. I'd never say I'm the most perceptive player. In fact, I think I have a bad tendency to mentally reduce game spaces down to just a bunch of colliders and hitboxes, sometimes missing out on the little details entirely. You could say it's actually good visual design when a game allows you to easily do this, but that's a whole other topic. Anyway, despite my blindness, I was pretty shocked that the game had this whole hidden layer of mythology and world building to it that had completely passed me by, and I was intrigued enough to dive back in and see it one more time for myself, armed with the knowing eye of a player who swallowed the Hollow Knight lore pill whole with no water. This time around, I fell completely in love with the game and its world. I was listening to music from the OST almost every day, I went for 100% completion and the true ending, and only then did I go back to the DLC to get the max completion of 112%, and hell yes I watched the rest of the lore videos. I even watched a few speedruns. This time around, when I met the game halfway and committed to it just for the sheer enjoyment I got from playing it, that is, just for the intrinsic reward of mastering the mechanics, the DLC clicked for me and I poured a shocking amount of hours into it, probably over 50 hours just playing the bosses in Godhome alone, compared to only 30 or so to 100% the base game. Beating every boss in Radiant mode, where you die in one hit, has given me some of the most rewarding and the most frustrating fist pumps I've ever experienced in gaming. I'm certain that anyone who's put the time in to beat all the bosses on Radiant and get to the end of the final Pantheon would be able to give you a detailed rundown of their strategies for each boss from memory. That's the amount of dedication that the game asks from you. And you don't even really get anything for beating every boss on Radiant mode, except a tidbit of lore, and your dad comes out of the game to say, "Well done son, I'm proud of you." But when you're fighting the same bosses again and again and again, trying to beat them without taking a single hit, you really have a lot of time to contemplate their intricacies. And if you're anything like me, going through this whole ordeal will really get you thinking about it. Why is this boss more satisfying to play than that boss? Why are some bosses still harder than others, even when they all kill you in one hit? And what even makes a boss fight good or bad anyway? Also, why am I doing this to myself? And why the fuck did Team Cherry make that one fight so unfair? Hell, it might even make you want to create a YouTube video breaking down the bosses in Hollow Knight and what makes each of them work. And the reason I'm telling you this is, well, I don't have to explain myself to you. This is the first boss from Crash Bandicoot 3, and every time you fight him it goes the same way. Dodge his attacks until he's vulnerable, then hit him back. Repeat 3 times and you win. Platformers and games aimed at younger audiences often feature bosses with this kind of simple tennis match kind of setup, where the boss is sort of like a puzzle with a single intended solution that you normally need to do 3 times to win. That solution is usually to keep running around until the boss lets you hit him. Since you only need to think about dodging or attacking at any one time, and the attacking doesn't really involve any interesting choices, this kind of boss fight is not especially challenging, but then I don't think it's supposed to be. It's more like an extension of the main platforming gameplay, but dressed up like a boss fight. For more action-focused games, like Mega Man, these two sides of combat, dodging and attacking, are both in play at the same time, and as we'll see, that can lead to some very interesting choices for the player to make. In case you hadn't guessed, the boss fights of Hollow Knight fall into the second category. Mostly. We'll get to that. I'm going to dish out my fair share of criticism for Hollow Knight throughout this video, but on the whole it's a game that has a really impressive amount of variety in its 44 bosses, and in case you can't tell by the length of this video, I think there's a lot to be said about their design and the different experiences you can get from playing them. Before we get into it and start going through those bosses one by one though, I think a quick rundown of what makes a boss fight is in order. I know, you're a pro gamer and you don't need some guy on YouTube to explain what a boss fight is, but stick with me here because I think we need to lay down the basics before we can go in depth on what's happening in Hollow Knight's bosses and what they're demanding of the player. So imagine you're playing your game, you get to the end of an area and there's a big room or arena, and you think to yourself, okay, here we go, boss fight incoming. Of course you're right, you pro gamer you, and after the dialogue or the animation introducing the boss, you regain control of your character. Naturally, you know the basic principles of a boss fight from all the other games you've played. The boss will have a number of attacks that they can do, and you'll need to respond to each of these attacks in some way, while also dealing damage to the boss yourself. The first time you see a boss, you'll have no idea what these attacks are or how to tell them apart, and you might have a hard time dodging or countering them. When you've taken enough hits to be low on health, you might start trying to put distance between you and the boss, frantically trying to heal in between the attacks you still don't fully understand, and knowing in your heart that you're completely fucked. Smash that like button for a relatable gamer moment. As you make more attempts, you get to know the boss's attacks better, and will be quicker at reading the telegraphs that tell you what move they're about to do. Consciously or otherwise, you will have strategized a response to each attack that works the best for you, and results in you getting by with as little damage as possible. You might even be able to sneak in some damage of your own if you're feeling risky. You see the telegraph, you play your response, repeat until you win. But it's that last bit about sneaking in damage which is the key to everything, and it's also what distinguishes different playstyles and skill levels, and allows the player to express themselves during the fight. Since you're in control of how quickly you deal the required amount of damage to beat the boss, you're ultimately in control of how long the fight goes on for. If you're cautious or new to a certain boss fight, you might prioritize dodging and only attack the boss when it seems extra safe. When you've gained some knowledge and learned the boss's moves, you'll be weaving in and out of their attacks while dishing out your own counterattacks at every opportunity. Your strategies will change and improve as you begin to understand what each of the boss's moves means, and what works and what doesn't. This scale, with caution on one side and aggression on the other, is something we'll come back to a few times in this video, and I think all of the best mechanics of Hollow Knight feed back into it in some really clever ways. I've started thinking of boss fights like a kind of input-output machine happening in the player's head. You read the boss's actions as input, and output your own actions via the controller. When you're dealing with a steady input stream of information and outputting another steady stream of your own responses, this can lead to an amazingly satisfying feeling when you feel like you're dancing with the game. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this can honestly be a thing of beauty that has to be played to be experienced. There's just no way watching another person play can compare because your brain isn't involved in the same input-output processing as they are. Of course, it usually takes a certain amount of dedication and learning to get to that incredible state of flow, but you can say that about a lot of things that are satisfying. So maybe this is starting to sound like a really simple formula. If you can boil a boss fight down to just input and output, call and response, how can it be that some bosses end up being more satisfying than others? Well, now imagine if the input or output stream of information isn't steady, and the game places artificial buffers where you're forced to wait before you can make the move you want to make. You already know the boss's next move, and you know what you need to do in response. That is to say, your brain has already performed the input-output calculation, but you have to wait before the game will let you do it. Periods where you have to sit and wait are absolute poison to a good boss fight, and I think the reason they feel so bad is because they stall that input-output machine in your brain. But there's another level to this that can feel even worse. Nothing kills the satisfaction of a boss fight more than periods where the boss is invulnerable or disappears. If the player is usually in total control of how long a boss fight lasts, by virtue of how quickly they can deal enough damage to win, then in moments where the boss can't take damage, the player has lost all ability to control the fight and is just stuck waiting to be able to deal damage again. Your input-output machine is effectively switched off for sections like this, and it can seriously feel like a frustrating waste of time, even if you're not a speedrunner. The genie boss from Cuphead is a great example of this. However skilled you are, the second phase with the pillars will always take the exact same amount of time, which grinds against the other phases of the fight where you're always capable of dealing damage and therefore always in control. And there's even another wrinkle to this that I haven't mentioned yet, which is the element of randomness that needs to be present in every boss fight. A boss fight without any randomness at all, where you knew the order of all their moves in advance, would just be a memory test, and wouldn't really satisfy the input-output machine in your brain with this steady stream of calculations to make. Generally speaking, the random element is going to be the boss selecting from one of their available attacks. You don't know what they're going to do until their telegraph, at which point you can begin your response. In a good boss fight, their next move is unknown and unpredictable, but once the move has begun, then you should be able to quickly tell what response it needs from you and act accordingly. It's this flow between predictability and unpredictability that can keep a boss fight feeling tense, and it makes it necessary for your I/O machine to be constantly making those satisfying calculations. When this balance is out of whack, it can be another thing that makes a boss fight feel frustrating. Too predictable and it's boring. Too random and it can be game-breakingly frustrating. It's one of the worst feelings when random chance causes you to fail, when you lose not because of your own mistakes, but because the game was feeding your I/O machine unreliable information. There are Hollow Knight bosses on both ends of this extreme, as we'll see later. But wait, there's more, because we still haven't really covered how all these different elements can make a boss fight feel easier or more difficult. But hey, I've got to save something for the rest of the video, and I'm really not ready to get into the difficulty thing yet, so let's get to the actual boss fights now. If you're as familiar with the bosses in Hollow Knight as I am, you've probably already seen many examples of what I've been talking about in the footage I've played. Maybe you've even had flashbacks to mastering those bosses yourself. Just before we move on though, I think it's worth pointing out here that a lot of this stuff you would really only notice if you put in the time to master these bosses and beat them on Radiant. Not only because of the large amount of time this will cause you to spend fighting them, but also because the one-hit kill forces you to completely understand every boss's moveset before you have even a chance of succeeding. This is why I often found it useful to go back down a difficulty level and practice on Ascended mode until I was confident I had a consistently reliable response to each attack. When you're allowed to take hits and still succeed, it doesn't always matter if those hits were down to your own mistakes or RNG. In fact, you might not even notice while playing. Likewise, sections where you're not able to damage a boss probably won't frustrate you on a casual playthrough because you're not likely to be fighting them again and again. And this also means that you don't need to worry so much about optimizing your internal IO machine. In my case, however, I've dived so deep into Hollow Knight that I hit my head on the bottom. So now that we've covered the basics of boss fights and my own crackpot theories and metaphors about what makes them work, let's get into the bosses themselves so that I can stretch those theories to breaking point. I spent some time thinking about the best way to organise the bosses for this video, and it turned out not to be as simple as grouping them into good boss, bad boss, or hard boss, easy boss. Some bosses are satisfying to play despite being quite easy, yet others are boring to play because they're too easy. Some of the hardest bosses are among the most satisfying to play and the most rewarding to master, but at least one of these hard bosses is just downright fucking unfair and feels terrible to play. But this is also where the experience of mastering these bosses can loop around on itself, and what seemed so difficult and insurmountable to begin with can become easy once you know what you're doing. When I think back on some of the first bosses I beat in Radiant mode, I have to laugh that I ever considered them difficult at the time. I'll demonstrate examples of all of this as we go on, but for now let's just say that difficulty is a challenging thing to pin down. Anyway, the method I settled on for structuring this video is to group the bosses in roughly the order that the game presents them to you, and to try and draw conclusions as we go. Some later bosses might get a bit less attention than others, if the interesting things about them have already been mentioned, but I'll definitely mention every boss at least once. So, let's begin with Vengefly King and Gruzmother, some of the earliest bosses in both the main game and in the Hall of Gods. As it happens, these two bosses make a great example of how small changes can cause a big difference to the player's enjoyment of a fight. Both are easy bosses, more like mini-bosses really, and even adding a second Vengefly King and spikes to Gruzmother's arena on the higher difficulties doesn't raise the complexity by that much, although the spikes do force you to change the strategy you were probably using before on Gruzmother. Each boss has only two moves. Vengefly will either swoop or screech to summon more flies, whereas Gruzmother will either charge directly towards you or bash the floor and ceiling in a simple pattern across the screen. Both movesets are simple and pretty straightforward to respond to. So then, why is one of these bosses an agonizingly boring slog and the other one is just average? Well, it all comes down to the player's ability to deal damage, and therefore their control over the fight. Gruzmother's arena is quite small, and you're pretty much always able to damage her at any point in the fight, meaning that if you understand her moveset and feel comfortable avoiding hits, you can take a very active position in dealing damage and bring her down more quickly. Compare this to Vengefly King, who spends most of his time in the corner of the screen and has a lengthy wait time in between his attacks. Your opportunities to damage him are fewer, and it lends this fight a more reactive feel than Gruzmother's. Yeah, you can use spells to damage Vengefly when he's in the corner, but you still need to wait until you can get 3 hits in to build up enough soul to use the spells. It just doesn't feel good when the player already knows what they're going to need to do, but are forced to wait for the game to let them do it. If the joy of a great boss fight is in making quick calculations and responding to a steady stream of inputs, then this fight against Vengefly King, where you spend half the fight waiting and the other half performing basic responsive to simple moves, is one of the least enjoyable in the game. His summon move gives you a crumb of decision making to do, but when you're in a boss fight, only damage done to the boss really brings you closer to victory, so it feels like a time waste, especially because the flies are so easy to deal with. And for a real slap in the face, sometimes his screech doesn't even summon anything, so the game made you wait and then didn't even give you anything to do. What the fuck, guys? Fortunately, almost every boss from here on out raises the complexity and gets more enjoyable to play. Let's move on to Brooding Morlek and the two fights against False Knight / Failed Champion, both of which make great examples of how the player's moveset can change the feel of a fight just as much as the boss's moveset. Coming to Godhome after completing the rest of the game means you'll have the Shade Cloak, and with it the ability to dash through an enemy without taking damage. This makes the Morlek fight a bit easier because you can get out of some of his attack zones more quickly and get in more counter hits. In the case of False Knight though, it can completely change the optimal strategy for the fight. Battling False Knight at the start of the game with no upgrades is kind of tedious when you know what you're doing, and you have to slowly get out the way of his attacks without much chance to take risks or go for extra damage. His attacks have really long wind-up animations, and the whole fight moves at a glacial pace. This isn't such a big deal though, because he's the first compulsory boss in the game, and it makes sense for the fight to be simple. Fighting him again in Godhome with the Shade Cloak is a totally different experience. Because of his long telegraphs, you've got plenty of time to dash through him and get a bunch of free hits on him from behind. This strategy of dashing through a boss to attack him from behind while he carries out his attack is one that's going to show up a lot in this video. The Shade Cloak gives the player the chance to express themselves by playing a little bit more riskily, and allows you to end the fight more quickly if you're comfortable with it. I'm certain that Team Cherry made the first fight against False Knight this way on purpose, to introduce new players to how boss fights were going to work, and so that scrubs didn't find the first boss too hard and quit. The reason I think this is because, well, I lied, the fight actually isn't compulsory, since you can break down this wall and leave the fight early if you're too good for it, or if you're a speedrunner. Of course you'd never notice that on your first playthrough, and you might even be saying, "Wait, what?" as you're watching this video right now. The other reason is that there's a much harder Dream Boss variant of the fight if you come back to his arena later that absolutely wrecked me on my first playthrough in 2017 and made me walk away to go somewhere else. So here's a good opportunity for us to start talking about what makes a fight difficult. Failed Champion does 2 masks of damage with his attacks, which naturally makes the fight harder because your mistakes are more costly. The speed of the boss's attacks is also greatly increased, so your input-output calculations and responses need to happen faster as well. Gone are the lengthy telegraphs, and more molten rocks fall from the ceiling when the boss does his rage attack. The shockwave caused by his slam attack is higher as well. So if this boss was daunting enough to make me run away scared on that first playthrough, why am I now able to pretty consistently whoop his ass with no hits whenever he shows up in a Pantheon? It's definitely true that the 2 masks of damage he inflicts made it harder to develop my strategies for each of his moves, since I would die after only half as many mistakes as in other bosses. He was jumping around the room so quickly, with what felt like a constant barrage of rocks coming down on me, that the fight honestly felt unfair at first. This is the first truly difficult boss I've mentioned so far, and it demands a certain amount of mastery over the game's controls. There's no way you're brute forcing through this one with dumb luck. But once you have that click moment, where you realise that by staying close and dashing at the right times you can nullify his attacks while getting in plenty of counter hits, this boss quickly begins to feel less daunting. There's also a fatal flaw in Failed Champion, which is the final nail in the coffin to its difficulty, and it's a move which is a holdover from False Knight. After a certain amount of damage is dealt, False Knight or Failed Champion will be staggered so that you can hit his unarmoured head. After this stagger, the boss will always jump to the middle of the arena and do his rage move. This means that if you manage to stagger him once, the fight is pretty much over, because from this point on you always know what his next move is going to be. It's possible to sneak in enough damage during this rage attack to cause the boss to go into another stagger, and another rage, and another stagger, and oh look, you won. This doesn't feel especially rewarding because it's not really engaging that I/O machine in your brain, and it doesn't require any creative responses from you. It's more like a very simple memory test. Well done, you staggered the boss. Do you remember what he does next? I will say in its defense that Failed Champion is kept from being boring despite this obviously dominant strategy, because the movements required of you to burst him down like this are quick and fairly complex. The random element of the falling rocks keeps you on your toes, and it just doesn't go on for too long. Still, it makes a good example of a fight where the perceived difficulty can vary greatly depending on your familiarity with it, and an even better example of how too much predictability can drain all the tension from an encounter. I definitely think the harder version of this boss should have had the rage move taken out, or at least had it made harder to predict when it would happen. I'm skipping over Hornet for now to lump together Moss Charger, Fluke Marm, and Oblobbles. All of these are more like mini-bosses with a single attack each, and honestly I forget about Moss Charger almost every time because it barely feels like a boss fight at all to me. Technically it does have 2 attacks, but his leaping attack goes over you anyway, and I don't think it really adds much complexity to a fight where the obvious strategy is to stand still and press X until you win. Here's some footage of me doing that on the hardest difficulty in the game. Yeah. Fluke Marm is an odd example of a boss where the player's damage output can be the difference between a trivial fight and a more frustrating one. If you can kill the little flukes spawned 2 at a time by the boss in 1 hit, you'll probably beat her on Radiant in 1 or 2 tries and never look back. But when I first ran into Fluke Marm in the overworld with an unupgraded weapon, it was another ordeal that made me leave and come back later, because having to land 4 hits to deal with them rather than 2 means you barely have any time to focus on the boss before she spawns more, and if you screw up, you might get more spawned in before you've even dealt with the existing ones. The Oblobbles make for a simple boss fight since they only have 1 move, but the pure randomness of that move can still make it nerve-wracking when getting in close to land some hits. Maybe dangerous is a more fitting word than difficult for this fight, because the obvious counter to the randomness is to just play extra cautiously and only go in to deal damage when you know it's safe between boss attacks. It doesn't necessarily demand a higher level of skill from the player, just a greater amount of patience. And you can consider this complaint about randomness to be a teaser for some bosses coming up later. Ooh, we'll get to that. I'm gonna group the 2 fights with Hornet in along with Hive Knight, since they do have a few similarities. Both are single opponents armed with a similar weapon to the player, with slashing and piercing moves, and a move that spawns hazards in the arena. We're getting closer to the mid-game bosses now, where movesets are more complex, and the player has choices to make and multiple viable strategies to pick from. In a normal playthrough, the first battle against Hornet, called Hornet Protector in the Hall of Gods, is probably going to be the first complex fight like this that the player comes across, which is a nice touch considering her place in the story of Hollow Knight. Incidentally, it's also the earliest boss that I see people memeing about being difficult, but maybe I should take the YouTube comment section with a few more pinches of salt, because I don't remember struggling that much even on my first playthrough. So let's talk about why Hornet feels like a complex boss fight, and maybe why she feels like the first bump in difficulty for so many new players. Hornet has 4 attacks she can use, more than any other enemy or boss up to this point in the game. A lunge, an aerial lunge, a nail throw, and her thread storm attack. She's usually airborne when she does this last one. Believe it or not, this is actually more attacks than most bosses in the game are capable of doing, and the large number of possible moves from which she can draw lends a real unpredictability to the fight, as well as giving the player more things to strategize responses to. There's an important addition to her moveset besides these moves, however, and I think it's another thing that sets her apart as feeling more complex than what's come before. She also runs and jumps around the arena even when not attacking, which lends a further unpredictability to her movement, and turns the fight into a struggle against an enemy that's about as agile as you at this point in the game. When she jumps in the air, is she going to do her storm attack or not? You have no idea, so you'd better stay on your toes. You can't just wail on her in between attacks like you could with earlier bosses either, because she moves around just as much as the player does. It's the first fight that starts to feel like a real back and forth between the player and the boss, where the game begins to give you a steady stream of input and asks for a steady output in return. Hornet's second form, encountered much later in a normal playthrough, Hornet Sentinel, increases her speed and adds 2 extra moves, one that spawns spiked hazards in the arena, and the other a parry move, where she'll go into a guard stance and immediately counter with a wide slash if you attack her while she's in this stance. Interestingly, this is a move that has a valid strategy of not attacking the boss for a moment, though you have other possible responses to it as well. And in addition to her large moveset and constant movement, I think the fact that she's the first boss where each of her moves has multiple viable responses contributes massively to the battle's feeling of complexity. This goes for her earlier fight too, but the parry move offers the best example to explain it. When Hornet enters her guard stance, the cautious player could do nothing, or sneak in a quick heal, or get some distance and use a spell to attack from outside the range of her counter. The aggressive player could bait out an attack and be ready to quickly dodge it, or pogo on top of her to avoid the counter and land the next hit, or get on her other side to attack from behind. This wide range of possible responses on both sides of the spectrum makes the player able to express themselves more in the fight, compared to False Knight, who may possibly be the only other boss the player has seen up to this point, and you'll see a stark difference in complexity. As the player improves their skill against a certain boss, they will generally move further along this scale, from cautious newbie to aggressive veteran, and it's the bosses that offer multiple viable strategies at different points on this scale that feel the most satisfying and interesting to play. Boss fights where the play looks the same between someone beating it for the first time and someone mastering it on Radiant mode have a big problem, which we'll cover when we get to some of the worst offenders later. For now, I'll say that Hornet is an excellent example of a boss that offers you lots of options, and it's great to fight a boss who feels like she has as many moves as you do. Maybe I've gone a ways towards explaining why she's also the earliest boss that gives new players trouble, because of this sudden spike in complexity. Assuming I didn't just imagine that or fall for the memes in YouTube's comments. Yeah, I know, I said I was going to mention Hive Knight, but yeah, I don't have as much to say about his fight that doesn't also apply to Hornet. One thing I could add is that some of his moves can overlap. For instance, he can do his bee or needle summon, and then commence his next attack while the previous one is still in progress. This can cause the player to panic when their brain suddenly has 2 inputs to respond to at once, and it can create situations where switching from aggression to momentarily focus on dodging or getting into a safe zone is a preferable strategy. As in all good boss fights, this is a choice the player needs to make for themselves, and it's an interesting way of adding depth and unpredictability to the fight. Okay, maybe there was something to say after all. Sorry to the Hive Knight gang. He's also the first boss I've mentioned so far who can teleport into attacks, rather than having to move from point to point in a more standard way, although we're about to cover a boss that takes this idea to its absolute extreme. So, without further ado, let's get into what many consider one of the best and most satisfying fights in the game, the Mantis Lords and the Sisters of Battle. And oh my god, we haven't even covered a third of the bosses yet. I hope you're enjoying this. If you're still watching and you don't actually care, it's okay mum, you can stop. I really won't mind. Maybe come back after you played the game. The Mantis Lords only have 3 attacks, which is fewer than Hornet has, and they also don't have any free movement at all in between attacks. In fact, the Mantis Lords teleport both into and out of their attacks, meaning the player's only option for dealing damage is to dodge and get in a counter hit either during or directly after their moves. This means there's pretty much only one way to fight them, And if you've been paying attention, then you might think that this goes against every principle that made the Hornet fight so complex and interesting. And well, you'd be right. So why are the Mantis fights so highly praised? Well, despite the relative simplicity of the fights as far as strategy goes, the attacks come thick and fast enough that you're constantly in a state of tension. The attacks layer and overlap just enough that you need to start responding to the next one as soon as, or even slightly before, you're finished responding to the previous one. There's barely any downtime at all like there was against Vengefly King, when you had to wait in between his attacks. This is true even though the Mantis teleport all over the place and can spend a fair amount of the battle not even on the screen. Once you get used to the rhythm of it, it's not a particularly difficult fight. I beat even the harder rematch against all three at once, Sisters of Battle, on my first try, and didn't take many more to master them on Radiant mode either. But I think that the relatively low difficulty actually contributes to the masterfully satisfying feeling of flow you get while playing it. Mango Lords is probably one of the best boss setups in the game at giving you a constant stream of inputs to deal with and react to, and even though the necessary responses are on the simple side, it's the quick and consistent rate of output the game expects from you that makes it feel engaging, and so good. In this way, the fight is a purely reactive one, without much chance for the player to express themselves, but it leans into this so well that you simply will not care about any of that while you're playing it. Funnily enough, I think you could draw a comparison between this kind of fight and the Great Wall tiger riding levels from Crash Bandicoot 3, or the auto-scrolling levels from old school Mario and Sonic games. These are levels where everything the player does is a reaction to the steady stream of information that's being provided by the game, sort of like the platforming equivalent of the Mantis fight. And no, I'm not just saying this because I already had footage from Crash Bandicoot. I'm actually going to cheat here and drag a later boss forward a bit to make this point more clearly. Soul Warrior is almost exactly the same as the Mantis fights. His moveset is practically identical. He has a lateral move, a vertical move, and a projectile move. Only the arena is different, and he only teleports into attacks but not out of attacks, whereas the manatees teleport both into and out of their attacks. This difference is absolutely key, because it introduces a bit of downtime in between Soul Warrior's attacks that just isn't there against the Mantarinos, subtracting from the steady flow of input and response that makes their fight feel so good. Soul Warrior gives the player enough time in between attacks to think about them, and will probably make you realise just how simple the fight really is. And yes, the other obvious big difference is that Soul Warrior is a single enemy, whereas the Manlet Lords are the first boss fight I've mentioned that features multiple enemies. But the thing is, you're not really fighting two enemies with the Mantises. You're fighting one enemy that can now attack twice as fast, and with certain attacks overlapping. If it was two enemies with different movesets, then it would be about giving the player more to deal with. But it's not. It's about asking them to respond more quickly and confidently to moves that they've already been trained on by having to start the fight one-on-one. This is exactly why there's a huge drop in tension when you take out one of the Manchegos and instantly lower the boss's attack speed by a half or a third. A way around this could have been to have all of them share a health bar, or to have some special phase kick in once one or two had been picked off. Okay, final word on Mantis Lords. The small arena with the spikes on either side is 100% necessary for making this boss moveset work. Because they only move between attacks by teleporting, the total space of the arena needs to be small enough that you can always reasonably get to them to land a hit. The small arena also means that their lateral stab move can always begin from the same spot, which is essential in a boss that teleports into every attack. There aren't really telegraph animations in this fight per se. It's more like the location where they appear is the telegraph. You need to know instantly when they appear what they're going to do. The side means a stab, above means a drop, the wall means a projectile. Compare again to Soul Warrior, who can just teleport to the side of the player wherever they may be in his much wider arena. In his fight this is fine because there's no chance of another attack overlapping with this and putting you in an impossible spot. So here we are, we've made it through what I arbitrarily decided to call the early bosses of the game. There's been a lot to say so far, and I'm honestly staring at my word count in disbelief, so while I think it would be a good idea to stop and recap some of the wider conclusions we can draw from what we've seen so far, I also think it might be better to save it for closer to the end, when all we have left are the endgame bosses that serve as the capstone for Hollow Knight. So instead, let's take a breather and talk lore for a minute, because a few of these bosses have great details that actually tell a story through their design, and I don't just mean their visual design. For example, I realised when writing the script for this video that there are probably lore reasons why the battle against Hive Knight is so similar to Hornet, since in the lore she was trained in combat by the Hive Queen. This might be the most subtle example of storytelling through boss design that I could find in the game, although I wouldn't put it past Team Cherry to have included an even more subtle one that I missed. In the Mantis Lord's arena, you can see the crumbling podium of a fourth lord, and you might wonder what happened there. Much later, in the Queen's Gardens, you can come across that traitor lord who betrayed the Mantis clan and willingly accepted the infection into his body to increase his strength. Sure enough, he's much bigger than the other Mantis lords, and he does double damage. His projectile attacks also have this infected tint to them. Troop Master Grim will always bow at the start of his fight, and if you damage him during this bow, then he'll go straight into his balloon attack, which usually only happens in between phases, and during which you can't really damage him and need to focus on dodging the bullet hell fireballs. If you let him finish his bow before attacking him, he'll start with his more normal moves instead. It adds a bit of character to Grim, and it gives the player a chance for a bit of expression as well, although if you do hit him when he's bowing, then you're an idiot. This might be an obvious one, but Oro and Matto use the same nail arts that they teach you in the main game. Paintmaster Shio uses a paint version of the Great Slash, and his fight is just fantastic for presentation all round. Nail Sage Sly uses all of the nail arts during his fight, since he's the original master who taught the brothers what they know. The Collector has a similar appearance to an unarmoured Kingsmold, an enemy type encountered in the White Palace. If the Kingsmolds were created by giving shape and form to Void using these molds, also found in the White Palace, then we can assume that the Collector might have been an early failed prototype of this process, obsessed with protecting creatures by putting them in jars. As far as I can tell, there's no text anywhere in the game that says this, and it's something you need to piece together yourself, just from the visual and environmental designs. It's a shame that Team Cherry didn't include a similarity in gameplay as well, like a shared attack or movement between these two enemies, but who knows, maybe they tried that and it made the connection too obvious. Even without that, it's compelling storytelling and it gets a thumbs up from me. Grey Prince Zote might be the boss fight that's imbued with more personality than any other, with Dung Defender as a very close second. From his extra long title card, to his posturing and yelling, to the fact that some of his attacks can suddenly stop midway through when he trips and falls over. Every part of this fight had me grinning ear to ear. It's also kind of funny that even in Bretta's dream of him, Zote is still a clumsy, bumbling fool. And finally, the Godmaster DLC added a new hidden NPC called Fluke Hermit, who dishes out some lore on the Flukes and the Fluke Mom. So this doesn't actually have anything to do with the Fluke Mom boss fight itself, but I wanted to bring it up because I'm just constantly amazed by the imagination and dedication that Team Cherry have for fleshing out this world they've created. There's no question that it's one of the reasons why the game has resonated so well with players, and Team Cherry is clearly aware of this and are happy to oblige. But seriously, hats off. Okay, that's enough talk about lore and characters. It's sadly still quite rare for games to tell stories through their mechanics like this, and I wanted to give Team Cherry some credit where I felt it was due. You can think of this section as a breather in the middle of a massive analytical pantheon. If nothing else, hopefully it was a good chance to grab a cup of lifeblood and heal up in the hot spring before we dive back in. Watch your head. I'm starting us on a low point so that we can get it out of the way. I'm sorry, but we have to talk about Nosk. The fight against Nosk has never ever felt satisfying or rewarding to me, and I think there are a few things contributing to that. He's the only boss in the game where I would count his movement as one of his attacks, and when he starts skittering left or right, he goes all the way to the other side of the arena, which is usually going to be completely off screen, or he suddenly stops in the middle of the arena with no warning and spits out a spread attack. To make matters worse, after a certain amount of damage has been dealt, he gains another move in which he jumps completely out of the arena this time, where he can't be attacked and rains down goo from above. If you've made it this far, then I shouldn't have to tell you why this move is a frustrating one. On the whole, Nosk is unpredictable in a way that just doesn't feel properly fair. Though his moves are basic, his telegraphs are super short, and in the case of his spread attack, he can stop on a dime in the center of the arena and just start spewing. This kind of boss fight, where the player never feels like they can reliably respond to what the boss is doing, pushes them towards playing in a way that's cheap and not fun, simply because it's more reliable and consistent than more risky options. I wonder if the arena being so big and Nosk constantly dashing off the side of the screen were deliberate choices on the part of Team Cherry to try and make the player feel like they're constantly under attack from an unseen and unpredictable foe. Because, well, it does feel like that, and it feels bad. And speaking of deliberate choices, Flying Nosk may look like Hornet, but it's really a combination of Nosk and Vengefly King, which I hope I've convinced you by now are the two worst bosses in the game. There is no way this isn't a troll by Team Cherry. I can't add much that I haven't already said about those other bosses individually, but I will complain about how the flying bosses fly away from you if you dare to try and hit them when they're vulnerable at the edges of the screen. I'm not kidding when I say this almost pushes them into practical joke territory as far as I'm concerned, because it breaks what I would say is a general convention in boss design, where the boss is at their most vulnerable in between their attacks. Don't get me wrong here, rules are made to be broken and nothing should be set in stone when it comes to creating something original. But in this case it just feels like the boss, and Team Cherry, is giving you the finger for trying to take advantage of this unwritten principle of enemy design. Let's skip ahead to Crystal Guardian and Enraged Guardian for a hot minute. It's the same boss twice, but one is quicker and does double damage. These fights are incredibly simple, but it's one of the only bosses I can think of in which a certain attack option, in this case pogoing, is completely taken away from you, which, like trying to breathe water, may be a nasty shock when you first realize it. Ultimately though, it only pushes you into discovering the already pretty obvious dominant strategy even quicker, which is to teleport behind him and say, "Nothing personal, kid." Taking options away from the player like this can create interesting situations against ordinary enemies, where it can add to the complexity and variables a player needs to account for when traversing an area, but I don't think it really works in a boss fight, especially one against a single enemy, and Team Cherry wisely doesn't use this trick again. In a boss fight, you really want the player to have full access to all of their tools and as many options as possible, because in the closed environment of a boss arena, the complexity comes mostly from interaction between the movesets available to the player and the boss. And if you just came here from 5 minutes in the future to check if I contradicted what I'm going to say later, check again. I said mostly, which means it's basically impossible for you to prove me wrong. Moving on to Traitor Lord, there isn't much new to say on this boss, although every time I say that I end up writing a huge paragraph anyway. One interesting thing about Traitor Lord is that his moveset was expanded in one of the minor DLC updates to the game. In addition to his basic moveset, ripped straight from the standard Mantis enemies, he gained a shockwave move that has to be shadow dashed through, and a glaive throwing move that eagle-eyed viewers may remember from 10 minutes ago. This is actually true of Nosk as well, who originally could only run left and right and leap around. Fuck Nosk though. The fact that Team Cherry added to Traitor Lord's moveset suggests that they weren't happy with how it was in the base game, and I wonder if they gave him double damage to make up for this original shortcoming. Only a small handful of bosses do 2 masks of damage like this, most of them saved for the endgame. so it is a little weird that Traitor Lord is on that list. But yeah, could just be a lore thing to show how the infection has made him stronger. I couldn't find anything on the wiki about this, but I'm 100% certain that the Shade Gate near this boss was originally placed after the Traitor Lord fight in the first release of the game, and then moved to before the boss once they'd added his new moves. Team Cherry had to do this in order to guarantee that you had the Shade Cloak before fighting this boss, since they gave him a move where the only correct response is to Shadow Dash through his shockwave. Ordinarily, you know by now that I'd be complaining that giving the player an input where there's only one correct output they can give in response is a design choice that reduces complexity instead of increasing it. And yes, that is true here, but I think it's just about saved in this case because the dash is a key part of the player's moveset that has more utility than just getting through these shockwave attacks. You're likely to be dashing all over the place anyway, and since the Shade Cloak has a cooldown timer, there's a bit of strategy and forward planning that has to go into using it. I think some care went into making sure that the shockwave will always give you enough time for your Shade Cloak to recharge, unless you really screw up and do something stupid like dashing away from it. Oh hey look, I found something to say about Traitor Lord after all. Umu, let's go! I was immediately curious when I first got to Godhome how this fight would work, since the normal fight in the overworld requires the help of an NPC, Quirrell. And sure enough, Umu is the only boss with a major difference between its overworld and Godhome version. Instead of Quirrell appearing to make Umu vulnerable for the player, you have to knock explosive jellies into it before being able to get a few hits in. So you might be thinking, this is great, sounds like they've put control of the fight into the player's hands instead of making them wait. And you'd be partially right. In order to make this work, Umu gets a third move in which it summons the exploding jellies to float from the bottom to the top of the arena. Its other two moves stay the same, but they're moves that were originally made for a fight that was mostly about waiting. Either the room fills with electricity and you have to get to a safe spot, or a series of electric balls spawn on top of you to keep you from standing still. This tension between having to manage Umu's position as it slowly follows you around the arena, and find a clear shot on knocking a jelly towards it without it backfiring, while also dodging the electric hazards, actually kind of works. It starts to feel more like the arena itself is the boss, with Umu just being a moving weak spot that follows you around. It's a challenge all about traversal and avoidance, which is fine of course, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, and it could even be a refreshing change from the other bosses of Godhome. This is the bit where you skip back 5 minutes to complain that I contradicted myself. Welcome back if you just did that. There's still more to be said about fights where the arena itself generates complexity in the boss, but I'm saving that for a bigger section later. The problem with Umu, however, comes in with the random element. You might have to sit through 2 electric attacks before Umu performs a jelly summon, which just ends up feeling like wasted time. If you're unlucky and you don't get an easy shot line itself up with one of the jellies, you're left with a choice. Hunker down and wait for the next summon to see if you get luckier, or take a risk and hit a jelly when you're not 100% sure it will get Umu without also damaging you or putting you in the path of an electric ball. Since waiting is boring, and it's natural to want to beat a boss as fast as you can, especially if you're trying it again and again on Radiant mode, I think most players will go for the riskier option too. And if this backfires, as it often does, of course you can say that this is the player's own fault for getting too greedy, but can you really blame them? If they have to choose between playing cautiously and being bored, or playing aggressively to try and get it over and done with quickly, well, I think that's no choice at all. It's possible that I might have beaten Umu on Radiant in fewer tries if I'd played more patiently, but it would have been at the expense of my moment-to-moment enjoyment of the game. The best boss fights, in fact the best gameplay systems full stop, are ones where the design encourages you to play in the way that's the most satisfying or the most fun. Umu, with its repetition and randomness, on top of spending most of the fight invulnerable, is a boss that pushes you towards playing in a way that's frustrating and feels like a time waste. Let's forget about Umu and randomness for now, and look at 2 or 3 bosses side by side. The Collector and Dung Defender / White Defender. I'm going to refer to these last two together as Defender because most of my points can apply to both, but I'll make it clear if I'm only talking about one specifically. Defender and Collector have a couple of similarities on the surface. Both can disappear, either off the top or the bottom of the arena, and both of them throw hazards around which have to be either dealt with or avoided. Maybe you can see where I'm going with this. One of these is boring, while the other is one of my favourites in the game, and I actually wish it was longer and had more to it. Team Cherry have said online that they thought so too, which led to them adding the tougher White Defender variant. So let's get into the differences that make these bosses feel like night and day. First off, when the Collector goes off the top of the screen, the player has nothing to do but wait. By now, we already know why this feels bad. When Defender goes underground, the player can actually use the dive spell to force him back up and get some hits in. Immediately, you can see a massive difference. The player actually has some decision making to do here. Should I heal or should I dive bomb? But here's the kicker. I didn't even know you could do this until I'd already beaten both of these bosses in Radiant. I saw it in a speedrun afterwards. And yet, I still hated the Collector and loved Defender, so there must be more going on here. Fighting the Collector is repetitive, with its cycle of jumping into the ceiling, knocking down jars, dropping down and jumping about, playing on a loop until the fight ends. Attacking the Collector also doesn't fill your soul meter, and there's a sensible lore reason for this. The Collector is a being made of void, so has no soul or life force to drain, or something like that. But in a fight that's already an extremely basic one, snipping out a system that's a major source of player options and complexity in the combat system was a bad call. Yeah, I know you can get soul from the creatures that come out of the jars, but I think my point still stands. So obviously Defender is a more complex and satisfying boss than the Collector because the player has more control over the fight and can strategize more deeply over soul usage. But I think there's something else that really sets the Defender apart, not only from the Collector but from most bosses in the game. Phases. Defender isn't the first boss we've seen that has phases, but it does offer some of the best examples, and I'd say it's the boss that embraces the idea most heavily. Defender is all about shifting through phases or states. The fight itself has distinct phases, where Defender beats his chest and does a new attack pattern after taking a certain amount of damage. But even more than that, his attacks themselves feel like phases that could completely shift what the player needs to focus on. And it's the length of his attacks that really sells this feeling. Take for example his Reddit move, where he starts flinging shit around the arena, creating bouncing hazards that need to be avoided, and sometimes ending with the boss himself turning into a ball and bouncing around. For the duration of this move, the player's strategy for damaging the boss has to completely change. The key thing here is that the player still has options for dealing damage while the boss is in his different states, as opposed to so many other bosses that change into states where the player can't deal damage, and therefore loses all control over the fight. It's the varied range of states that ask for different responses from the player that make Defender feel so satisfying to play, and it makes him one of my faves. I think the only black mark against him is that White Defenders, and possibly Dung Defenders, shitballs can't be shadow dashed through. I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I've spent enough time on him already, so I'll just say that even though it breaks a rule that holds for every other attack in the game, and might even be a glitch because of that, it's not too bad once you reprogram your brain to remember it. Now we're going to group together God Tamer and Watcher Knights, the two bosses from this section that feature multiple enemies. Interestingly, God Tamer is the only boss where you fight multiple enemies of a different type. In every other boss that features multiple enemies, it's in the form of multiple instances of the same enemy. If we think back to what I said about the Mantis fight, my theory is that this is because there are different priorities that Team Cherry has when they're designing a multiple enemy boss. Is their goal to give the player more to deal with at once, or just to make the attacks come faster? In other words, are you really fighting multiple enemies, or are you fighting one enemy that's now able to execute multiple attacks at once? Just to be clear, neither of these design decisions is inherently better than the other, but each of the multiple enemy bosses from Hollow Knight can be placed somewhere between these two ideas. If Mantis Lords is purely about making the attacks come faster, then God Tamer is purely about giving the player more to deal with, while Watcher Knights falls somewhere in the middle. In the God Tamer fight, only damage dealt to the beast brings the player closer to the end of the boss fight. You can deal with the rider if you want to make the fight easier, but there's really no point, since the beast is the more dangerous of the two anyway, and once the beast is defeated, the fight is over, regardless of whether you've defeated or even damaged the rider. Both of these enemies have fairly simple movesets. In fact, the rider has a pretty extreme wait time in between her attacks, but I'm certain this is a deliberate choice because a fight against multiple enemies with different movesets would have been very hard to balance, and to make sure that it was always possible to win without taking an unavoidable hit. From a gameplay standpoint, a more complicated moveset might also have been just too much input for the average player to keep track of, although that's total speculation on my part. Team Cherry had quite an interesting decision to make for this boss as well, to choose which one of the enemies, or whether both of the enemies, needed to be defeated in order for the fight to end. I'd guessed that the beast was chosen because it has more attacks and moves around the arena more, although having a powerful enemy protect a weaker, less aggressive, real boss that was the key to ending the fight could have made for an interesting encounter. All in all, the multiple enemy boss fight is used quite sparingly in Hollow Knight, so I'm excited to see what Team Cherry can come up with for Silksong, because there's a lot of untapped potential here. Let's talk Watcher Knights. I said that they fall somewhere between Mantis Lords and God Tamer on that scale of priorities, and that's because they share a moveset like Mantis Lords, but also always exist in the arena at the same time, like God Tamer, and unlike Mantis Lords. At the start of their fight, you'll be against a single Watcher Knight, where you can dominate with the now classic technique of dashing through and getting in free hits while they finish their animation. Once you've dealt with the first one, or if you take too long, one or two more Watcher Knights will join the battle, although with never more than 2 Watcher Knights active at once. The fight kind of self-balances in this way, clearly a deliberate choice by Team Cherry. And though I can't help but wonder about an alternative fight where more and more enemies join if you're taking too long to dispatch them, I think they made the right call here. There's a problem that crops up in any game that has boss fights against multiple enemies, where the player has fewer opportunities to safely deal damage than they would against one boss, since enemy attacks can overlap and create situations where there's never a chance to sneak in a hit. If you've played Dark Souls 2, then you know what I'm talking about. Thankfully in Hollow Knight, spells really come into their own in fights against multiple enemies like this, since you can deal heavy damage to both at once if you time it right. And it's a good thing too, because without spells this fight could get kind of tedious, since dealing damage via normal attacks largely involves that dominant strategy of slashing from behind, and can't be done at all during 2 of the boss's 3 attacks, the ones where they curl into balls and either roll or jump around. In addition to this, the Watcher Knights take some time to become active and join the fight, so you have a brief window to get some one-on-one hits in before you're up against multiples again. Hollow Knight mostly avoids the pitfalls that other games can fall into when making the player face multiple foes, so I think the game deserves some credit for that. Okay, there are a few bosses left in this middle section, and I really mean it this time when I say there's not much new to cover here, even though some of them can be really enjoyable fights. I don't consider Soul Master and Soul Tyrant to be in that category, and looking back, I have to say I'm surprised I struggled against Soul Master on my first playthrough back in 2017, because I don't find it particularly difficult now. Interestingly, some of the tactics I used back then must have been burned pretty hard into my brain because I still remembered and was able to instinctively use them for my recent playthrough. I think the reason I don't enjoy these fights is because Soul Master just teleports all over the arena to get into place for his attacks, meaning you spend a lot of the fight just walking towards him. The final phase of these fights, where the boss does a bunch of slam moves over and over before finally becoming vulnerable during some homing orb attacks, definitely succeeds at being a panic-inducing surprise the first time you see it, but it frustrates a bit when you know what you're doing since it just requires the same response every time. I will say, however, that my opinion of this final phase improved a bit when I found out from watching a speedrun that you can sneak some damage in just before each slam. Grey Prince Zote has far and away the best presentation of any boss in the game, a great compliment in a game that has tons of well-presented bosses. I seriously enjoy this fight, and not just for the great character moments, there are some interesting decisions to be made by the player in this one. When Zote stands still to spit out smaller enemies, you can either take the chance to get in close and get some free hits in, leaving the enemies as hazards you'll have to deal with later, or focus on the enemies as soon as they appear to prevent them ever becoming a threat. pogoing on Zote's head while he flails around with his sword is a highlight, but the fact that he can stumble and fall with no notice killed me on Radiant mode more than once. His hitbox suddenly shrinking when he falls over can make you whiff your downward attack, and then you'll die to contact damage when you fall into a heap together. It's funny but still a bit frustrating. Maybe an audio cue or a freeze frame could have been included here to help you know when he was about to trip and fall. That could have been a chance to add more humour to the fight as well, but still this dream encounter against Zote is a truly standout part of the game, and I can't wait to see how Team Cherry takes this concept further and adds character to the bosses in Silksong. Okay, last one for this section, Broken Vessel and Lost Kin. Uniquely, this is a boss where the harder variant actually loses an attack and has fewer moves than its easier counterpart. I'm guessing Team Cherry made this choice because the missing attack, in which the boss stands in the middle of the arena and spits out a barrage of rising blobs, was either too easy to avoid and counter, or more likely led to some impossible situations when combined with the more frequently spawning balloon enemies in the harder version of this fight. And speaking of which, these constantly spawning balloons that appear completely independently of the boss's other attacks are the main thing that makes these fights stand out from other bosses. It makes for an unrelenting back and forth between attacking the boss and dealing with these spawns, with some complex decision making involved in choosing when to focus on the boss for extra damage and when to pop the balloons to stay safe. It's an interesting concept, not often used in Hollow Knight, and I would welcome its return in some of Silksong's boss fights. Phew, finally made it. Now all that's left is the Warrior Dream backer bosses and the final bosses of the game. All of the Warrior Dreams are based on submissions by Kickstarter backers, and on the whole they make for pretty simple fights, so I won't spend long on most of these. If you've been through the ordeal of beating each boss on Radiant, then you know what's coming, and I hope I can give you some catharsis when the time comes for all the memories you've been repressing until now. This section will also serve as a kind of second intermission, where I'll recap some of the observations we've made and try to tie things together nicely so that our analytical soul gauge is full before we get to the final bosses and unload on them. First up is Gorb. Not much to this one, but nice how his attacks get slightly more complicated at certain damage thresholds. His more difficult fights in Godhome can seem daunting at first because of the chance of falling in the new arena, and the fact that his attacks are harder to dodge if they're coming from the side as opposed to from above. It's a trick used in a few of the Warrior Dreams, where the different arena invalidates the strategy you were probably using before, and kind of forces you to relearn the fight. If you're stubborn and keep trying to do it the old way, then it might give you more trouble, but generally these arena changes end up testing your patience more than your skill. Next, Elder Hu. I really don't like this one, as he only has 2 moves, and one of them causes him to disappear while you make a ridiculously easy dodge and then sit around waiting for him to come back. He can do this move twice in a row if you're unlucky. He can also teleport across the arena, forcing you to waste time just walking over to him. We've seen all of this elsewhere before, and it sucked then and it sucks now. Marmu is a boss that I always dread coming up in a Pantheon. Something about this fight just always feels completely unpredictable to me, and I pretty much expect to lose some health here. I think it's the fact that she can sometimes hurl herself at you from an unfavourable angle that means your upward slash will miss her. I'd be willing to accept a get good on this one, to be honest, but the fight is so basic that I have 0 patience for it, and I'll play sloppily just to get it over and done with a bit quicker. Galeon is sort of similar to Marmu, and actually a little bit like the concept I floated earlier of a weak boss protected by a more aggressive enemy. In this case, the enemy is a bouncing scythe that more or less acts independently of the boss. You just need to avoid the scythe while holding up and slashing the boss. And like Gorb, he also shows you how much damage you've dealt by spawning other hazards at certain damage milestones. Also like Marmu, Galeon is another boss that I'm happy damage boosting through, because I'd rather just get the fight done than play it more carefully. The fight against No Eyes is a bit like Umu, in that it's more about traversal than combat. Platform over to where the boss is, while avoiding the Medusa heads, get a few hits in, repeat. This one can be a bit unforgiving on Radiant, since you can't see the whole arena at once and can't immediately tell where No Eyes has teleported to. Another boss where you're nudged towards playing cautiously and boringly to avoid being put in a difficult situation. Zero, like Gorb, is made harder by a change to his arena, which in the end just serves to make the simple fight drag on longer by giving you less opportunities to attack and making dodging more difficult. Also like Gorb, he tells you how much damage you've dealt by increasing his attack speed after a certain threshold. And that's it. Okay, we're here. No more running. You knew this was coming. We now have no choice but to talk about the source of complexity in Hollow Knight's boss fights. Yes, complexity is a word that I've thrown around a lot in this video, and I think maybe I'm overdue for explaining exactly what I mean by that. I've called fights complex when the player has meaningfully different options and is able to express themselves through these options, but it's not quite as simple as complex good, simple bad. Mantis Lords is actually an incredibly simple fight, since the player doesn't have much in the way of meaningful options or much control over the total length of the fight, but it's still one of the most enjoyable in the game because it keeps you engaged in a constant, fast-paced call and response. Still, on the whole, complexity is a good thing, and it's usually at times when the player has a lot of options that Hollow Knight's boss combat really shines. Okay, so now you're wondering what I mean by having options and expressing yourself. Well, that scale of caution versus aggression that we've seen a few times already comes into play here. Every player will be somewhere on this scale, generally moving from left to right as they get more confident and comfortable against a boss. The beauty of a complex fight where the player has a lot of options is that a player at this side of the scale, fighting a boss, and a player at this side of the scale, fighting the same boss, can look completely different. Think back to fighting Failed Champion, where a newcomer might feel completely overwhelmed, but once they've experimented enough and found some successful strategies that work against the boss, they can dominate and beat him with no hits every time. And if now you're wondering what I mean by dominate, ask your parents. A lot of the observations I've made throughout this video can apply to boss fights in any game. That's the point of a case study after all. But I'd like to go through and praise a few features specific to Hollow Knight that I think really elevate it and show just how deeply integrated the different parts of its combat system can be, and how they all feed into this same principle of giving the player options for expressing themselves. The soul resource is an ingenious bit of design because it encourages the player to always be seeking to deal damage, and it also rewards both cautious and aggressive players by allowing them to either heal a lot or use spells a lot. Lifeblood also feeds into this principle. When you're overhealed with Lifeblood masks, you're able to use all your soul on spells, since you don't have to worry about healing until you lose those masks. This gives more cautious players a chance to taste what it's like at the other end of the scale. The stagger mechanic also feeds into it, giving players a chance to heal, or a chance to line up a powerful attack. Charm loadouts might be the ultimate expression of this kind of player choice in the game, but there are some that are just obvious must-haves. Any loadout that doesn't have unbreakable strength and quick slash is just making things harder for no reason. Realizing that overcharming yourself, which usually carries a penalty of taking double damage, doesn't make a difference in Radiant mode where you die in one hit anyway, can be a nice breakthrough moment as well. Charms certainly do add a lot of depth and choices for the player to make, but it's more of a complexity in tactics than in moment-to-moment gameplay. Choosing your charms is all done before the battle, whereas choosing what to do with your soul resource is done in the heat of the moment. The crux of all this is that the resources available to the player have multiple uses, or have multiple variables attached to them. This makes deciding what to do with that resource a choice with real consequences. If you use a spell for extra damage, you have less soul for healing, and vice versa. Equip charms to increase your attack range, and you have less slots for charms that increase your spell damage. By choosing one thing, you are by necessity neglecting something else. This is what adds depth to a combat system, and Hollow Knight absolutely excels at feeding its mechanics into this principle, so I think Team Cherry deserves a massive amount of praise for getting this so right. Of course, none of this complexity in the player's options and moveset would mean anything if the bosses themselves didn't give the player the freedom to make use of these different options, and we've seen many times throughout this video how important this is. Part of the reason Vengefly King and similar fights like the Collector and Elder Who feel unsatisfying to fight is because they have phases where all of the player's options are taken away and you're forced to wait. Whether you're playing it for the first time or the 100th time after mastering it, these phases will always play the same. There's no way to improve because there's nothing to improve at. This kind of one response only kind of combat can work if that's all the boss is. It can even work really well, as it does with the Mantis Lords. Where it falls apart and frustrates the player is when the fight alternates between giving you options and taking those options away. Mantis Lords is testing you on your consistent responses to a small handful of attacks that come quickly, and it commits to that and feels great to play. Elder Who is supposed to be testing you on your ability to deal a certain amount of damage to the boss, and yet there are parts of the fight where you simply can't deal damage no matter how good you are. Remember an hour ago when I was talking about the genie boss from Cuphead? I bet you're glad you joined me down this rabbit hole now. I want to be clear that I'm not saying this flying section is outright bad. It might even have made an enjoyable stage on its own if it had been fleshed out into one. But it has absolutely no place in a boss fight that's supposed to be about dealing and avoiding damage to a boss. I will die on this hill. Unfortunately, one of Hollow Knight's final bosses falls into this pitfall of continuously giving and taking away options from the player. I'm sure you know which one I'm thinking of. We're not quite done talking complexity because there are some boss fights that try to add it in a different way, and I want to explain why I think this doesn't really work, but first I'll just say that that's not necessarily a bad thing. I realized when writing about Soul Master that almost none of the bosses in Hollow Knight were originally designed to be played over and over again. Soul Master's final phase is designed to shock you and make you panic, which it's very effective at doing the first time you see it, but on repeated plays, it obviously doesn't have the same effect. I wonder if Team Cherry knew that they'd eventually be implementing a boss-focused mode in Godmaster, whether they would have reconsidered the design on some of these bosses to make them more palatable for playing again and again. Although the fact that Flying Nosk exists, who was only added as part of that Godmaster DLC, and does not feel good to play again and again, might prove that they don't think like this, and that's fine. In fact, on the whole, I'm kind of glad this isn't the case, for the variety that it gives to a first playthrough, and despite my complaints about some of these bosses, many of these complaints only raise their head when you're repeatedly playing these bosses, completely divorced from the original context they were intended for, in a huge, open-ended 20-hour game. So, other than increasing the player's options regarding their moveset, and then making sure that bosses give them the freedom to use that moveset, how does Team Cherry add complexity to those boss fights? It's not used in many bosses. In fact, most of those that do include it have been the warrior dreams from this section, but one answer is in traversal and hazards that are part of the arena, though only Umu and No Eyes were originally designed with this in mind, whereas the other warrior dreams and Gruzmother only have the hazardous arenas appear on harder modes in the Hall of Gods. In the latter case, the reason I don't think this arena complexity really works is that it makes a fight more tedious without necessarily making it more difficult. If you're playing on Ascended or Radiant mode where these arenas appear, then you've probably already come up with a strategy for defeating the boss, and a response for each of its attacks. The addition of hazards to the arena means that the player has fewer opportunities to safely carry out their strategies, since a spike pit might make a certain strategy unusable at a certain time, and the player needs to devote more attention to staying in a safe zone. Look at Zero for an example, where you have this big platform in the middle and smaller platforms at the sides. The best strategy here is obviously to stay in the middle, since Zero spends more time above that platform than the others as he moves left to right. You can dodge and deal damage the same way you would in his easier fight with the simpler arena, but now you can only do it when he's floating above you. You see what I mean? It's more tedious, but not really more difficult. And it looks suspiciously similar to what I mentioned a few paragraphs ago about fights that take options away from the player. Is that a valid way to make something more difficult? Well, let's come back to that. The bosses that were always designed with complex arenas in mind do have a similar problem, although Umu is sadly also tainted by the fact that it spends most of the fight invulnerable. But by now you know how I feel about that. So, to use No Eyes as an example, the problem is that when the simple act of traversing to a boss can be a dangerous one due to hazards, it might sometimes end up being a wiser move to just wait until the boss is in a more favourable position. Of course, it's still true that the player is making a choice to pick caution over aggression. It just doesn't feel satisfying to me knowing that a legitimate strategy would be to just spend the whole fight on the middle platform and wait until the boss comes to you. Again, one of the final bosses we've yet to mention does this as well. Maybe you know which one already. And so that's finally it for the Warrior Dreams. Let's move on to the final bosses and never look back. Alright, I'm just kidding. For real this time, let's get into Markoth. If you've only played the base game, or for some reason you've made it this far without having played Hollow Knight at all, you're probably wondering why I've hyped up this one boss so much. If you have only played the base game, I bet you barely even remember this fight. That's because Markoth is a boss that takes problems that only appear on Radiant mode to the absolute extreme, stretches it to breaking point and then jabs you in the eye with it for hours upon hours of your precious time on this earth. No joke, it was going through the experience of beating Markoth on Radiant that made me want to make this video. The very first notes I made for this script were in the form of a paragraph-long rant about him. It sounded kind of like this. Frustrating fight because it feels like you can't get good. Shield can randomly change daggers spawn under you when you jump. Spawn and dodging the projectile is too risky to be boring. Which picture of someone crying and caption saying, "You are now me laughing." There were times during my Markoth ordeal where I just had to put down the controller and laugh at the absolute absurdity of it. I'll try to explain why Markoth is so infamous among those who have put in the time to beat him with no hits on Radiant mode, but first a quick note on randomness. We've already seen random elements in most of the boss fights so far, and I think you can split that into two kinds, macro and micro. Macro randomness covers stuff like which attack the boss chooses to do next. You generally won't be able to predict what it will be until he starts his telegraph, but once he does, you should be able to immediately respond with whatever strategy you've developed. Micro randomness is about the little dice rolls that determine the boss's attacks themselves. We've seen this in the molten rocks that fall from the ceiling in the fight with False Knight, failed champion, in the projectile attacks from the Oblobbles, the spread attacks from God Tamer and the Nosks, and so on. Both macro and micro randomness can be important for lending a feeling of unpredictability to a fight, though when the micro doesn't go in your favour, for instance when a projectile happens to spawn in an inconvenient location, it feels far more unfair than when the macro goes against you. For example with the boss doing two moves back to back that you're less comfortable dodging. Naturally, the player's counter to this macro randomness will be to get good and become more comfortable with those moves so that they're not reliant on luck. The player's counter to micro randomness is, well, the only options are to either respond very quickly to random inputs, which is risky, or to devise a strategy that works in all possible random cases at once, which is rarely doable but is the clearly preferable strategy when it is. Flying Nosk has two attacks that make good examples of micro randomness. When the blobs fall from the ceiling, the player can either get lucky or use quick reflexes to avoid them. There's no obvious strategy here that neutralizes all possibilities at once. When Flying Nosk does its spread attack, however, you can respond the same way every time, by jumping and shadow dashing through it, regardless of the randomly determined pattern of the spread. I'm sure you can figure out which one of these two attacks feels the most worrying when you know it's coming. And so, here's a list of all the random elements in the fight with Markoth, separated into macro and micro. Oh no. Oh no! And there are no strategies that can neutralize all possibilities either, so you have to react to everything as it comes. This is bad enough by itself, but remember how in our flying Nosk examples they were single attacks that needed to be dodged while the boss couldn't be damaged anyway? Well, when you're fighting Markoth, you need to deal with all of these random variables while also getting in close to deal damage. And the fact that Markoth himself seems to float around the arena completely at random means that you can miss a pogo and die just because he happened to move at the wrong moment. There are just too many variables at play to get any kind of consistent strategy going here, so what I ended up doing was bouncing on Markoth's head as many times as I could at the start of the fight, and hoping that he didn't move the wrong way or spawn a dagger in the wrong place. At the halfway point, where he spawns a second shield for himself, I would burst all of my spells and get in a few stray hits where I could. The second half of the fight feels like an absolutely insurmountable barrage of random attacks, where there's almost never a clear path to deal damage. I hate this fight. Team Cherry knows how crazy it is as well, because they put Markoth near the end of the final pantheon with the hardest bosses in the game. There are a few bosses that gave me trouble where the solution really was just to get good, but Markoth just absolutely spits on the idea of getting good. He more than deserves his infamy among those who have walked the path of the Radiant mode, and I hope I've done right by all of you out there who knew this fight was total bullshit and powered on through it anyway. We really are almost done now, only the 6 final bosses are left, but I wanted to find one last big idea before we get to them. Difficulty. The thing about difficulty is that it goes away the more familiar you get with something. It's the unknown elements of a challenge that make it feel daunting. How the fuck am I supposed to dodge that? Etc. So, once you've completely mastered and strategized how to dominate a boss in Radiant mode, if you later go into a Pantheon and fight a version with less health that also doesn't kill you in one hit, it's gonna seem like a breeze by comparison. I think this is related to that phenomenon in horror games, where a spooky monster can feel like a terrifying threat, right up until the moment it kills you. After that, when you understand its abilities and limitations, and you get familiar with it, it no longer feels threatening and in the worst case, could just become an annoyance in your path. At that point, you're more likely to try to game it by exploiting the AI than to be scared of it. Most people with an interest in game design probably know by now about Resident Evil 4's secret adaptive difficulty that will raise or lower the challenge of an area depending on how well the player's been doing. Nowadays it's exploited by Resi 4 speedrunners who deliberately take damage at certain points to lower the difficulty of upcoming areas. But before it was a well understood part of the game, I think it was a truly ingenious design decision, and might be one of the biggest reasons that playing and replaying Resi 4 feels so good. Long story short, it's an attempt to solve the problem in horror games where there's a massive drop in tension whenever the player dies. The fact that you can reload and try again takes all of the consequence out of the encounter, and in fact might even encourage the player to exploit this by deliberately dying until they succeed while using as few resources as possible, which is not exactly something you would do if you were scared. By secretly making it less likely that the player is going to die, Resident Evil 4 skirts around the issue and keeps that tense feeling going for longer. Amazingly, this hidden system still kind of works even when the curtain is pulled back and you know it's dirty secret. As long as you don't die, that is. The jig is definitely up when you have to retry a tricky section, and you could have sworn that there were more enemies here on your previous try. Now you might be thinking, what are you doing talking about Resident Evil 4 and comparing horror and difficulty? They are not the same thing. And of course you'd be right, but I think there is a goal that they share in common: tension. It's possible that mastering Hollow Knight's bosses in Radiant mode might actually end up subtracting from the tension of some of their fights. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is the case. In Hollow Knight, this isn't really a complaint because the game is about conquering and mastering those struggles, and the game didn't get easier, you just got better. In a horror game, mastering mechanics and turning unknowns into knowns naturally spoils the intended effect that the game is going for. But I do think a little something is lost even in an action-focused game like Hollow Knight, when a once daunting boss becomes second nature to the player. This is yet another problem that only appears once you start really digging into the bosses and playing them again and again in Radiant mode. but it can be a real problem when bosses start to feel boring if you're too familiar with them. And funnily enough, it's the bosses that remain unpredictable that continue to instill a bit of anxiety when you know they're coming up in a Pantheon, even if you've already beaten them on Radiant. Markarth and Marmu come to mind. On the other hand, the simple ones you can no longer be surprised by are more likely to feel like a time waste you wish you could skip past. This isn't a critique I can throw squarely at Hollow Knight, but just an observation on the nature of difficulty and challenge in games. I need to watch my footing around this difficulty rabbit hole because I can't see the bottom and I don't know if there's a way back out. But if you'll indulge me, is difficulty even real if it can change over time and be relative between players? If one player has a hard time with a certain boss and another player beat it on the first try, is that boss difficult? How can you measure difficulty if you can measure it at all? Does giving a boss more health make it more difficult, or does it just force you to keep fighting the same damage sponge for longer? If an enemy takes longer to kill and requires you to keep up dodging for longer, but you've mastered the art of dodging their attacks and no longer feel any tension when doing so, is it really more difficult or just more tedious? Does adding hazards make a boss more difficult if it can be beaten using the same strategy as before, except now it takes longer? I have no idea what the answers to these questions are. In fact, I think there really is no objective answer to any of this, although I'll leave it to the comment section on this video to correct me on that. Because if you were insane, you could take it even further and ask whether even giving a boss new abilities makes it more difficult. Wouldn't you just master those new abilities as well and roll them into all the moves that you already have no trouble with? Ow! I dived too deep and I hit my head again. Okay, no more stalling, we're moving on to the final bosses now. Chug some lifeblood because we're going all the way to the top, baby. The last bosses of a game are the hardest ones, everybody knows that. And except for fucking Markarth, I think that mostly holds true for Hollow Knight. So as we go through these final 6, I want to use my earlier thoughts about difficulty to try and explain how exactly that manifests itself. First up, Oro and Matto. The fight starts with the player against only one enemy to begin with, just like Mantis Lords and Watcher Knights. I think we can take it as a given that Team Cherry does this to give the player a chance to learn the boss's moves, so that it feels fair when they're pitted against multiples of them in later phases. Of course, this also means that all of those multiples need to have the same attacks. Oro and Matto actually share a lot in common with Watcher Knights, both in moveset and in their place in the middle of the multiple enemies priority scale I made up earlier. That is to say, you are fighting 2 enemies at once, but they have mostly the same attacks. Each brother has a separate special move that they can pull off with a lengthy telegraph to make it feel like a big deal, as well as sharing a slash move that's almost identical to Watcher Knight's, and a jumping slash that you'd have to be asleep at the wheel to get hit by. And just like Watcher Knights, fighting one brother alone in the first phase is a total breeze that you can do in seconds if you get a favourable pattern of moves. It's in the second phase against both brothers where the boss really begins, and where it begins to get complicated. See, there's a very strange quirk to this boss where the player's choices can dictate just where exactly on the multiple enemies scale the boss falls. Depending on your actions, the brothers may or may not attack at the same time, giving you an interesting amount of options and control over how the fight plays out. If you keep both brothers on the same side of you, they'll attack one by one, moving in close, making their move, then moving back to swap places. If you get caught between them, which sometimes can't be avoided, they'll both turn on you together, which can cause some serious panic and make you desperate to get back into a position where they will 1v1 like any honourable opponent would. When you're caught in the middle like this, the large number of possible move combinations they could pull off means you have to stay on your toes. The way this boss swings back and forth across that scale makes for a unique encounter with its own kind of difficulty slider built into it. Just as you're forced at certain points to put yourself into a dangerous spot between both brothers, the fight naturally has sudden spikes in tension between more manageable periods. But do they deserve their spot at the top for being the most difficult boss of their type? I'm tempted to say yes, but it really depends on what you think constitutes difficulty in a boss fight. You could make a convincing argument that oblobbles are actually harder because of the sheer randomness of their attacks, but since that ends up pushing the player into caution and tedium rather than gaining mastery over movesets, I've got to give it to Oro and Mato for managing to scare me with those spikes in tension even after I'd become familiar with their mechanics. Honourable mention goes to Mantis Lords for feeling so satisfying to play, even though it's not that difficult. Next, Paintmaster Shio. He's one of my favourite bosses, and I think it's because he hits that sweet spot between being easy to understand but tricky to optimise and master. His 4 attacks are all colour coded, which is a nice detail, and makes it easy to learn which attack is being telegraphed. The rhythm of his fight is most like Hornets or Lost Kins, where his attacks invite an obvious dodge before the player moves in for their own hits, or for more aggressive and experienced players, a counter that gets extra hits in by dealing with the boss's move and getting into attack range before his animation is even finished. All in all, Paintmaster Shio is kind of like a greatest hits boss, with most of his moves feeling like they come straight from other bosses. His purple Great Slash makes paint fall from the ceiling just like False Knight's Rage attack. His red attack is reminiscent of Dung Defender's Dive. His yellow slash is a bit like Crystal Guardian's Beam, or Hornet and Lostkin's Dash Slash that needs jumping over, and his blue move is like the spread attacks of Nosk and Godtamer. I don't mean this as a negative criticism. In fact, I didn't even realise until writing this section, and I think it absolutely works as the game's ultimate test against that kind of freeform boss. At least that's what I would be saying if not for what's coming 2 bosses later. Paintmaster Shio doesn't really introduce anything new in his boss fight, but that's fine, not every boss needs to have a completely unique twist to it. His fight is more like a refinement of what made so many others work, most obviously in his ripped off moveset, but also in areas like the length of his telegraphs, which are pitch perfect at this point for giving you just enough time to think about your response, and contribute hugely to the flow you can get into when fighting him. But is it difficult? I have to say no on this one, and put Shio in the same category as Mantis Lords, under satisfying but simple. Of course there are obvious ways Team Cherry could have made this fight more difficult, by adding extra moves or increasing the speed, so the fact that they didn't makes me think they were going for a kind of Tour of Hallownest effect with this boss, which I'd say it succeeds at very well. On to Nail Sage Sly. This boss makes for an interesting example when thinking about difficulty, because out of these final few he's the one with the quickest climb out of his difficulty curve. On the first attempt, it feels like he can dart all over the screen and keep up a devastating series of attacks that seems relentless. Once you've learned how to deal with his moves, and realised that he actually mostly does one move on repeat, he ends up feeling like the most exploitable boss of the final bunch. His most common attack takes quite a while, honestly maybe too long, to carry out, and when you know what you're doing you have more than enough time to get into position for some counter hits, although you won't get many hits in because there's very little downtime between his attacks. In this way the fight with Sly actually ends up becoming a little bit tedious, since he mostly does the same attack over and over, and when he does decide to do an alternative move, they're generally so wide and sweeping that you're better off going for a safe dodge than trying to risk a counter-attack, especially since you can bet he'll be back to the same old repeating move before long anyway. This is only half of Sly's fight though, because aside from Soulmaster, Sly makes up one of the only bosses in the game that sees a complete change of moveset when switching to a final phase of the fight. The first time you see this new phase is a serious what the fuck moment. If you thought Sly moved around a lot before, this part will blow your mind. He jumps around from wall to ceiling a few times until he makes a leap towards you and pulls off a spin attack before flying off again. First time I saw this, it seriously had me questioning how it would even be possible to damage him at all, but just like Soulmaster, while I think this final phase might be intended to panic you on a first attempt, it's not so tough when you realise what's going on. If you live like Paul Atreides and don't give in to the fear, you can meditate in the center of the arena and bait Sly into an attack, easily dodge, and then move back in for a counter hit. All in all, I think the fight against Nail Sage Sly might show better than any other that difficulty is relative and disappears once you turn the unknowns into knowns and get to understand how a boss works. That feeling of foreboding can morph into boredom and restlessness when the tension of the unknown is gone. Now you know what I'm gonna say. I have to give this one a not difficult. Pure Vessel is the real ultimate challenge when it comes to free-form boss fights in Hollow Knight. The two bosses after this have twists that put them in separate categories in my mind. Pure Vessel starts with 4 moves, already above the average for the game, and gains 2 more at separate damage thresholds throughout the fight for a total of 6. The highest in the game, and shared by only 3 other bosses, and 2 of them are the ones after this. Naturally, this makes the boss way more daunting because there's more to learn and strategize a response to, and it also makes for a tense anticipation in between attacks where you're never sure what's coming next. Since Enraged Guardian, which was a pushover anyway, Pure Vessel is the first boss we've seen for a while that does double damage, 2 masks per hit. Obviously it makes no difference on Radiant mode, but the extra damage does make learning the boss into more of an ordeal, and definitely adds to the feeling that you're up against insurmountable odds. On top of that, Pure Vessel's stagger doesn't really give you enough time to heal 2 masks, which is a bit shitty considering it's double damage, although maybe the idea was to push you towards equipping Quick Focus until you were more confident you didn't need it. This means that on Ascended mode, the best mode for practicing for Radiant, where damage is doubled again, Pure Vessel deals 4 masks of damage each time you slip up, meaning you have absolutely no chance of healing back what you've lost. Perhaps the biggest lesson I learned from Pure Vessel is the importance of re-strategizing when something isn't working. Pure Vessel has a floor spikes move where it teleports above you and slams down, damaging you if it hits you, but also causing spikes to rise from the floor across the whole arena. Initially, my strategy for this was to dash out of the way, position myself between 2 spikes to avoid damage, then get back over to the boss for 1 or 2 hits before its next attack. This spike attack has a sort of random element to it. As far as I can tell, they spawn at fixed intervals spreading out from the boss, but the exact position where the boss lands with its downward attack can't be known beforehand. After my dash, I had a split second to move either left or right to get into a safe spot, but I found that I could never quite react fast enough and constantly ended up moving into damage and cursing myself. I think the reaction time needed for this might just be slightly too quick, but I'd be willing to take a get good on this one if most players didn't have the same problem. Anyway, since my strategy was inconsistent, at least for me, clearly it needed rethinking. I had to come up with a solution that neutralized all random possibilities at once, so that I no longer had to rely on either lightning quick reactions or luck, which is exactly what I did. Instead of dashing to avoid the downward attack, I would jump to the side to avoid it, then move back over the boss to get some pogo hits in while the spikes filled the arena, and I was in a safe spot right over the boss's head every time. I'd lost so many Radiant mode attempts to those damn spikes that testing and coming up with a strategy to get around them completely, while also dealing some extra damage to the boss, was a hugely rewarding feeling. And I have another example of this. Since I'd used the strategy of dashing through and attacking from behind on so many other bosses, I naturally thought that Pure Vessel's triple slash would be another great opportunity to make use of it. Problem is, this triple slash carries Pure Vessel quite a distance through the arena, which lowers the effectiveness of the strategy as you have to backtrack after your dash to catch up to the boss. After a while I realized, however, that baiting Pure Vessel into doing this attack into a wall would mean that I could get in free hits while the animation played out and it was stuck in one spot against the wall, which made countering that triple slash into a seriously high damage event, even if it did feel a little bit like cheesing the boss. On the flip side though, this strategy made dodging the floor spikes attack nigh impossible, since there wasn't space to jump onto the boss's head because of the wall, and dodging was too risky and usually led to me getting spiked. On lower difficulties, this strategy still paid off because mistakes are allowed, and the high damage I was dealing more than made up for it. But on Radiant mode, I had to leave my wall strategy on the cutting room floor and just commit to getting good. And I can keep going with another example. Pure Vessel has two attacks with very similar telegraphs, a dagger throw and a tentacle attack, the latter of which he doesn't start using until close to the end of the fight, which ended up leading to some real frustration for me, though I'm willing to say this is my fault. My strategy for the dagger throw attack, which is present from the start of the fight, was to dash through the daggers at ground level and immediately get some counter hits in while Pure Vessel finished the attack. This strategy was so successful for me that it was drilled into my head to automatically dash towards the boss when I saw him spawn a certain distance away from me and hold his cloak open. Problem is, if you do this and it turns out he's not doing the dagger attack, you get hit with more tentacle than the protagonist of your favourite hentai. The fact that this tentacle move only starts appearing near the end of the fight means that you don't really have much of a chance to learn the subtle difference between the telegraphs, and I fell for this again and again and again, to the point where it became a kind of eye-rolling moment for me. Yep, there we go again. All of these examples really go to show the depth and complexity that can emerge from giving the player plenty of movement options to use against a boss, with an equally vast amount of possible moves. With the possible exception of the floor spike move, which can be strategized around anyway, I think Pure Vessel might be, well yeah, the purest example of a Hollow Knight boss there is. There are no truly random moves in there to throw you off, just a 1v1 battle against an opponent who demands a consistently high level of strategy and execution from the player. For various reasons that we'll get into on the next two bosses, I think Pure Vessel is without a doubt the most difficult boss that's also completely fair, and with enough practice you can go from getting killed in a few hits to dancing around the fight with a perfectly strategized counter to each one of the boss's moves. It's not my favourite boss, but I think it more than deserves the most fairly difficult boss award that I'm giving it. Nearly there now. Grim and his harder version, Nightmare King Grim, are next. The reason I put this fight into a different category to Pure Vessel is that it's not really a fight where the player has control over the length of the encounter. Grim is a single enemy, but teleports both in and out of every move like the Mantis Lords. I've praised that fight enough by now that you may be thinking that's a compliment, but whereas it's used in the Mantis fights to keep up a constant tension and allow their attacks to overlap, it has a different effect in the Grim fight. Since every single one of his attacks begins and ends with a teleport, each attack feels completely separated and disjointed from the one that came before it, and the fight as a whole never has those natural peaks and troughs, where the player or the boss could get squeezed into an unfavourable position and have to escape from it. Every time Grim switches moves, it's essentially a reset, where it doesn't matter what's come before it, and each move is like a 2-second burst of gameplay before you wait for the next one. Maybe I've swung too far to the other extreme and I sound too critical now, so let me say that it's not all bad. Disjointed as they are, his moves do still offer complexity through a variety of possible responses, and the move that ends in a spread of fireballs even forced me to re-strategize and figure out that getting in close was a more consistent way of avoiding them than trying to dodge further away, similar to my experience with Pure Vessel and its floor spikes. His Flame Pillar move is actually one of the most open-ended in the game for the free-form responses that it allows, though for some reason it only appears in the harder Nightmare King version. Since Grim is stationary and therefore more vulnerable during this attack, it makes sense to try and maximize your own damage output during this one. He spawns 4 pillars of flame under the player, one after the other, so you need to make sure you've moved out of the way before each one erupts. Outside of that, you're free to do whatever. I found a good strategy in letting the first 2 pillars miss me while moving towards Grim, then getting in 2 upward slashes from beneath him while baiting out the third, moving to the side to avoid it and getting in 2 jumping hits from the side before dashing through him to avoid the final pillar and getting in 1 or 2 final hits before he vanishes. For me, this was a consistent way of dealing a good amount of damage to the boss, but the absolute freedom that the player has to strategize here makes me certain that there are more efficient strats that have been found by others. To take the wind out of that praise a little bit, Nightmare King Grim's floor spike move is one of my least favourite because it's not particularly hard to dodge, and it removes the player's ability to deal damage, since Grim disappears during this attack. This is especially annoying because Grim doesn't disappear during this attack in his easier version, so Team Cherry changed it here just to piss me off. Sadly, there's an even worse move that appears in both versions of Grim, which is the Balloon Bullet Hell attack. Just like the floor spikes on Nightmare King, this move takes away all options from the player and forces them to spend a long time just dodging fireballs before they can get back to a part of the fight that they have any control over. I've already said enough times why it feels bad to have control given and taken away from you throughout a fight, and when you add the fact that his attacks feel so disjointed, Grim ends up as one of those boss fights that gets more tedious and unsatisfying the more familiar you become with it. But is it difficult? I'm in two minds about this one, because the bits of Grim that are good are really good, and while not quite as difficult as pure Vessel, they're challenging in the right way, by offering a complex range of options to the player. And yet there's also this time-wasting bullshit that extends the fight in the worst possible way, and adds more tedium than difficulty. Of the bosses that waste your time like this, I'm thinking Flying Nosk, the Collector, Elder Who, and so on. I can't dispute that Grim is the hardest, and probably the best of a bad bunch, so I'm giving him a begrudging difficult. So this is it. We've covered every boss in the game except one. Welcome to Absolute Radiance. This boss didn't take me too many attempts on the easiest attuned difficulty, but it took me a long time to beat it on Ascended, and then an equally long time again for Radiant. It's rare that I'll boot up a game and go for an entire session without making any progress at all, but that's exactly what happened for more than one multi-hour session of attempts against the Radiance, unless you count learning experiences as progress. So why the big gap between my successful Attuned, Ascended and Radiant attempts? Well, more than any other boss in the game, and remember you will have beaten and possibly mastered every other boss in the game at this point, defeating Absolute Radiance requires you to have a click moment, where you suddenly realise you need to approach it differently to every other boss. But that click moment only accounts for the jump from Attuned to Ascended difficulty. The reason it took me so long to beat it on Radiant after that is because this final boss is total fucking bullshit. I have a feeling this could be controversial, and people will say that I just needed to get good. So I want to make sure I explain myself well here, and I'm going to go into absolutely excruciating detail because there's a lot to say, but also to give you a feeling for just how excruciating the experience of fighting this boss on Radiant mode can be. This is a pain you have to know to truly understand. First off, to get that click moment, the thing you need to realise is that you have to prioritise dodging over attacking. I know that sounds obvious, surely on Radiant mode you need to focus on dodging for every boss, but Absolute Radiance takes this to a whole other level, where you absolutely must know what attack is coming before you even think about damaging the boss, otherwise you're rolling a dice, and depending on which one of her 6 attacks she uses, that attack may or not just appear on top of you and kill you. It literally is like rolling a dice in that respect, although it feels more like Russian fucking roulette. But the thing is, the odds are in your favour here. Only 1, or maybe if you're unlucky, 2 of her 6 attacks can spawn on top of you like this. Doesn't sound so bad, right? Maybe you like these odds. Yeah, well, on Radiant mode this doesn't matter. If an action could result in you getting hit 1/6 of the time, and you die in 1 hit, the wise move is not to perform that action because you simply can't take that risk. 5 times out of 6 the gamble would have paid off and you would have got some free hits in, but 1 time out of 6 your attempt would have been over and you'd have been booted back into the Hall of Gods, where you have to watch the entire 20-second intro to the boss again before you can have another try. Look, I know this is an aside and it isn't really related to the boss design itself, but when it's likely that you'll have more than a few attempts at the boss lasting under 20 seconds themselves, this wait time is a serious kick in the head, and another thing that really makes you wonder whether Team Cherry properly considered what it would be like for someone playing one boss repeatedly. Anyway, I want to be clear that I'm not necessarily accusing Absolute Radiance of being unfairly difficult, or of having unavoidable attack patterns. Most of my deaths on this boss can be blamed on some incorrect or slow response on my part. But if it's not unfairly difficult, then it is at least unfunly difficult. Yeah. Let me show some examples. Here's some footage of me absolutely destroying the first phase of this boss in half a minute because I just happened to get a favourable set of dice rolls. Now here's me dying on the first hit on multiple attempts, because a tactic that was usually worth it to get an early damage burst in sometimes met an unlucky dice roll and I just died. And yes, I know that the counter to this would be to hold back and wait until I know the coast is clear to use a spell, but that's exactly my point. Doing this is fucking boring, and especially so when you know that the main factor in how quickly you're able to beat the boss is just a series of dice rolls. Think back to those earlier bosses that had phases where they couldn't be damaged, and how it took control away from the player and felt like you were being arbitrarily held back. Against Absolute Radiance, you have to hold yourself back in order to make it consistent, which is just 10 times worse. Here's another example. In the second phase, if Radiance teleports on top of you, it could be an amazing chance for a turn of free damage, which could possibly end the phase right then and there, if she does the easily dodgeable Light Ray attack. If she does the sword attack instead, you will get hit, deal with it and cry some more. So when Radiance appears on top of you, what do? It's possible you've just been handed an early ticket to the final phase, but it's also possible you're going to be dead in 2 seconds. If you stay in case it's a favourable attack and you're right, you win. If it's an unfavourable attack, you are fucked. If instead you choose to dodge away just in case it's an unfavourable attack and you're right, you've chosen well. If it was actually a favourable attack, you've not only lost your opportunity to make the most of it, you may even have moved into a spot where you're going to have a harder time dodging that attack. When random chance can have so much of an effect on something as simple as whether to move towards or away from the boss, it doesn't feel like you can ever reliably make plans. Soul Master is another boss that teleports a lot, but it's always a good idea to move towards him since he doesn't have any attacks that will screw you over if you get too close. On top of that, you always know what he's going to do as soon as he teleports, based either on the telegraphs that he begins as soon as he appears, or on the location that he appears in, some of which always indicate the same attack. Every other boss that teleports around sticks to the principle of telling you as soon as they appear what they're going to do. Every boss does this except for, you guessed it, Radiance, who has the same telegraph for every fucking attack. Oh, and by the way, her attacks can also overlap, so it's essential to have dealt with each attack as quickly as possible, since if you leave it too late, you might end up having to dodge 2 at once, which really can sometimes be a no-win situation. And I'm not even close to being done yet. So far I've mostly been talking about the macro random elements of Radiance, that is, the dice rolls that determine which move she's going to do next. But oh boy, you better believe there's some micro randomness thrown into every attack as well. I actually don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, but I want to bring it up to illustrate how almost nothing can be relied upon when fighting this boss. The vertical daggers have a random pattern, and honestly I like the fact that there are both wide and narrow gaps you can fit through because it gives the player some choice. Same goes for the horizontal daggers, which also have narrow gaps you can dash through if you're a pro gamer like me. Those daggers, as well as the screen-filling beam that requires a shadow dash, can come from either the left or the right, and will sometimes fake you out and spawn again once, twice, or even 3 times when it reaches the center of the arena. The radial daggers can spawn in a random initial circle around the boss, and then rotate outwards either clockwise or anti-clockwise. These homing balls spawn in random locations, and there can either be 3 or 4 of them in the attack, although once they have spawned, their behavior should be largely predictable. The radial light beam attack comes from what seems to be an initially random circle, although I swear a beam was pointing directly at me too frequently for it to be truly random. But they mercifully can't spawn in the same place twice in a row, so the 2 subsequent attacks can be reliably avoided by standing wherever there was a beam in the previous attack. Obviously, it's the attacks which have reliable responses which are the ones that are safest for attempting counter damage of your own, which holds true in the first phase, but the teleports in the second phase can completely ruin this reliability, and is yet another random factor that can either help or hinder the player. If the boss spawns on top of you and does her homing ball attack, you can reliably get some hits in while dodging those balls. If she spawns far away from you and does the homing ball attack, it's suicide to move towards the projectiles which are homing towards you, so you'd better just focus on dodging and hope for a better dice roll next time. It's just impossible to devise a dependable plan when there are so many random factors at play here, which is why I said that this boss is largely reactive rather than proactive, and it feels like you never have any control. I'm sorry to bring them up again, but Mantis Lords are another fight that's largely reactive, and their attacks also overlap as well, but the random element there is macro rather than micro. That is, you don't know what the next attack will be, but as soon as the telegraph starts, you know how it's going to go, and you can plan accordingly. You also have a clear and obvious option for dealing damage after dodging each attack, so you're always in a fluid state of call and response, or input-output. This simply is not the case when you're fighting Radiance. If you're lucky, some attacks can give you a chance for unbelievably high damage counters, while if you're unlucky, then some patterns can drag on for a full minute with no chance for the player to safely counter. I wanted to compare to another boss here that uses micro randomness to the same degree as Radiance, without mentioning Markoth again, and there just isn't one. The closest comparison might be Oblobbles, who always do the same attack but with a random bullet spread. And just like Radiance, the Oblobbles fight also pushes you towards boring, tedious tactics, because there's no other way to make the fight consistent without introducing luck into the mix. I can let it go when it comes to Oblobbles because it's a short and simple fight that doesn't really outstay its welcome, but I would never call it fun or rewarding. Hey, how about we multiply that by 6 and make it the final boss? I'm done with the bulk of my ranting criticism now, but I'm going to keep going because there's a little bit more to the fight, and if I haven't proven myself to be a completionist yet, then maybe this will convince you. The third phase of Absolute Radiance is mathematically designed to make you choke. Once again, you have to train yourself to approach it in a less than obvious way in order to make your attempts consistent. It may look like an attack that can be reacted to on the fly, but since the beams are vertical and you're moving vertically yourself during this section, if the beam spawns on top of you while you're jumping, then you simply don't have time to finish the jump to get out of the way. Instead of beginning your jump between attacks, you have to wait until the beam spawns somewhere else, then begin your jump, since like I said, your jump can take longer than the length of one beam attack. You need another beam to act as a buffer to give you enough time. It may be a little bit counterintuitive, and luck can also have a huge effect on how easy a time you have with it, but at least it can be made fairly consistent once you understand it. The fourth and final phase of Radiance is also not too bad. I seriously hate these homing balls, but you can get a fairly consistent strategy going by bouncing on the boss and letting the balls zoom off the top of the screen. Thankfully they disappear for good if this happens, because if they came back down again, then I probably would have snapped my controller in half. You don't want to know what I would have done to my controller if there had been multiple attacks to dodge in this final phase. So, that's the whole fight, and in case you can't tell, my opinion of it has been pretty negative. So just as a counterbalance, I'll throw in that the transition between the first and second phases basically hands you a chance to build up much needed soul for free, which is very welcome and makes the fight just a little bit more bearable. I wanted to put some other positives here, but I can't think of any more. So let's circle back to that original question of why I had such a different experience on each difficulty level of this boss, because I think the full answer to that question tells you all you need to know. When I first unlocked Absolute Radiance, I beat her on attuned mode fairly quickly after unlocking her, despite not having mastered the boss at all. I realised my first victory was down to luck as soon as I tried Ascended mode and couldn't make it out of the first phase. I also realised that I couldn't repeat my victory even on the basic attuned difficulty. This is where I spent many hours grinding in attuned mode until I finally had that click moment and realised that I had to hold myself back in order to make fighting this boss consistent. I kid you not, I beat her on Ascended mode on my very first try after this realisation. Once I'd managed that, I felt that I had the skills and knowledge I needed for Radiant mode, and I started going for it, thinking that it wouldn't be too long before I made it. I was wrong, and I spent many more hours grinding for a victory on Radiant mode. At one point when I was in a slump and failing for hours and hours at a time on Radiant mode, I went back to the easiest attuned mode for practice and I beat it 3 times in a row. When you're allowed a few mistakes and you've built up a lot of knowledge about her attacks, Absolute Radiance really doesn't feel that much harder than any other boss. You can take the damage you get from any unfavourable dice rolls, and you can even get some heals in if you're so inclined. And the opposite can also happen. You could end up getting several lucky rolls in a row, say for example, if the boss keeps repeating an easily dodgeable attack and you get in a ton of free hits. Clearly this is exactly what happened to me on my first ever victory, and it's why I was able to beat the boss once early on, and then not again for a very long time afterwards. Hopefully by now I've made it explicitly clear just how much random chance can affect your attempts fighting this boss. When you take away that safety blanket of allowing mistakes, and a single hit can kill you, and force you to sit through the entire 20-second intro again, and yes, I am bringing this up for a second time, just one unfavourable dice roll can screw you over. So, is it hard? Hell yes it's hard, and even if it's technically fair and will never hand you an unwinnable situation, you will never ever feel in control during this boss fight. In the end, what really makes this final boss into a miss for me is the fact that no amount of skill or planning can overcome the absolutely brutal slog through random number generation that this fight really is. I've compared her to a few other bosses that share similar traits, even bosses that share similar random elements, but all of them let you overcome that randomness with careful planning and strategizing, and none of them punish you by presenting you with choices where you don't know what the right move was until it's too late. If you asked me to beat Pure Vessel again on Radiant mode, it might take me a few tries, but I feel confident I could pull it off because the boss is consistent and you can learn it. If you asked me to do Absolute Radiance again with no hits, I'd curl up into a ball and cry for my mummy. Overcoming and mastering the unknowns of its many difficult boss fights might be one of the most rewarding parts of Hollow Knight, so it was kind of disappointing that I didn't get that feeling when I finally beat Absolute Radiance. I just felt absolute relief that I would never have to do it again. Yeah, I wish I could have ended on that line, but I think a brief conclusion is justified, and the video already ended up being insanely long anyway. In my defense, there are 44 bosses in Hollow Knight, so even if I only spoke about each one of them for 2 minutes each, the video still would have been at least an hour and a half. So yeah, anyway, in this little wrap up, I just want to try and summarize what I think are the main ingredients of Hollow Knight's boss fights, and what lessons I think we can take from them. Let's begin with depth and complexity. Giving the player a lot of options in a fight, letting them express themselves and their skill level, and letting them ultimately control the length of the fight themselves via that skill, are all things that can make a boss fight feel more complex, satisfying, and rewarding. Hornet, Pure Vessel, Lostkin, Zote, Shio, and Dung Defender are all great examples of this, and they're all bosses that still feel great to jump back into even after defeating them many times. Bosses where this complexity and freedom of expression are missing produce the opposite effect. Instead of feeling satisfying, they feel frustrating and tedious because you have less control over the proceedings. Vengefly King, the Nosks, the Collector, Elder Hu, and Umu can all cause this feeling because they have phases or states where they can't be damaged, and the player might as well be reading a pop-up book with the game being the one deciding when to turn the page. Yes, the page that it's forcing you to stay on is still technically interactive, but you want to be on the next one. Of course, complexity, or lack of it, is not the only thing that can affect whether a boss feels satisfying or not. Oh, you knew I was going to mention Mantis Lords again. It's not a particularly complex fight, and there's not really much room for expression either, but the near constant stream of input-output that it demands from your brain is what makes it a masterpiece of flow. Grimm's fight has a similar call and response structure, but it doesn't work nearly as well because of the wait time between his attacks, and the questionable inclusion of phases where he can't be damaged. And the question is, what were they thinking? Multi-enemy bosses can make for some really interesting encounters, or they can just be a way to let attacks overlap and create a non-stop barrage for the player to avoid, which is used to great effect in Mantis Lords, and I promise that's the last time I'll mention them. Multi-enemy bosses bring with them a unique problem, in that they might suffer from a release in tension before the end of the fight, when you've defeated one or more enemies and only have the last one left. Oblobbles and God Tamer get around this by either ramping up the tension when one enemy is left, or giving the player the choice on whether to focus on the main enemy or to pick off the optional one to make things easier. But the Watcher Knights fall right into this trap, although it isn't too bad since their entire fight is about swinging between single and multi-enemy combat. Oro and Mato definitely lose out to this drop in tension when they're reduced to 1, but while they're both in play they show just how much the tension can spike by varying whether or not they both attack at once. In a similar vein to the multi-enemy boss fights, are the bosses capable of spawning smaller enemies that you need to devote some attention to, which can create some interesting options as you consider whether to deal with the smaller threats quickly or postpone it to get in extra hits on the boss. Zote, Flukmarm, Lostkin and the Collector are examples of this, but the way the Collector works means that you never really have an interesting choice to make, because the smaller enemies appear while the boss is off screen, and you usually have enough time to deal with them before the boss returns. Flukmarm doesn't make for much of a dilemma either, since it's obviously better to deal with the threat of the little flukes before moving on to the defenseless boss. This whole category seems like a bit of a missed opportunity, so we'll see whether Team Cherry chooses to expand on this idea in Silksong. Another trend present in a few bosses is arena hazards. These aren't necessarily a bad thing, but when they only serve to take options away from the player and push them towards more tedious tactics, that's when I think they become questionable. The hazards just about work for No Eyes, because that whole fight is built around them, but the addition of hazards to the Radiant fights with Gorb and Zero only serve to add tedium, not difficulty. I think the platforming and hazards in the Umu fight could have been fine if it didn't also have the invulnerable phases that turn it into a chore. I actually wouldn't want to remove that element from Umu, because the focus of the fight is really your positioning for the exploding jelly strikes. But it's just a shame that there isn't a similar platforming boss where the focus is squarely on the platforming. A handful of bosses make use of phases in their fights, which is more often than not used for novelty value. I'm thinking Nail Sage Sly and Soul Master for this one. Dung Defender might be the best example of natural, mini phases that don't really feel like phases, as his attacks are lengthy and can shift what the player is focusing on for an extended period. Traitor Lord, Hornet and Pure Vessel have fights where new moves are unlocked at certain damage thresholds, which is kind of like moving very subtly into a new phase. This is my favourite implementation of the idea because of this subtlety, which means the phases never interrupt the flow of the fight and escalate the challenge naturally, and serve as a convenient marker of how close you are to winning. And finally, a word on randomness. Every boss has some kind of random element to it, either macro or micro or both. This is 100% necessary because otherwise a fight would be a memory test rather than a test of your input-output skills. Look no further than Failed Champion to see what happens when a boss's next move becomes completely predictable. The type of randomness employed in a fight can completely change what kind of challenge it becomes. What I've been calling macro randomness, or the boss's positioning and move selection, can generally be countered by the player coming up with a strategy to use for each telegraph, whereas micro randomness, or randomness affecting the exact trajectory or placement of enemy attacks, either requires an all-encompassing strategy that works in every possible scenario, or the failsafe of good old-fashioned reaction speed. Zote offers a good example of both kinds of randomness. When he jumps in the air, after that move has been selected macro randomly, I know I need to employ my dodging strategy and jump over the shockwave that will be generated when he lands. This requires timing on my part, but it doesn't require too much in the way of reaction speed, since I have plenty of warning from his telegraph. When Zote uses his move that spawns exploding Zotelings, it's micro-randomness that determines where precisely they will spawn. Since I can't account for their locations before the fact, I have to react to the situation in the moment, though in this instance you do have a generous amount of time to get to a safe zone. Randomness is a healthy part of every boss fight then, but, well, you know where I'm going with this. Markoth and Absolute Radiance are way over the fucking line. When the random elements in a boss fight are to such a degree that the player starts feeling like they have no control over it, something is very, very wrong. In the case of Markoth, This is because of far too many micro-random factors that all overlap at once to create a situation where the player can't work out a reliable strategy. If one or two of those micro-random factors were removed, say if Markoth moved in a consistent pattern, or if his daggers spawned in a consistent spot, then the fight would become so much more manageable. I don't think it even matters which random bits got removed. It's not any element in particular that ruins things, it's just that there are too many. As for absolute Radiance, well, it's just a mess of macro and micro randomness, and the fact that some dice rolls can swing heavily in your favour and some can do the opposite, kills any feeling of consistency to the fight. A highly skilled player might be able to beat Hornet or Pure Vessel far quicker than a less skilled one, because those fights offer a lot of control to the player. With absolute Radiance, a new player might get lucky rolls and finish the fight quicker than a more skilled player, and I'm gonna say that leaving so much of the fight in the hands of random chance is a cardinal sin of boss design. See, look, I just said it. Okay, so these are all of our ingredients for a Hollow Knight boss fight. Which design choices work for each boss will all depend on what exactly the boss is supposed to be testing. For those complex bosses, it's kind of like a free-form sandbox where the goal is to maximize your damage per second while avoiding enemy attacks. For those flow bosses that teleport around like Grim and Lords, it's about testing your ability to consistently dodge and counterattack. For multi-enemy bosses, it can either be about giving you overlapping attacks to dodge, or giving you multiple threats or movesets to worry about at once. Hazards can introduce a platforming challenge into the mix, and phases can switch up movesets to induce panic or force the player to change their focus. Randomness can contribute either tests of strategy or reaction times to any of the other categories, but just don't push it too far or you can take too much control away from the player. Hollow Knight has an incredible amount of variety in its boss fights, and I've massively enjoyed diving deep into their design for this video. If you've stayed with me through this ridiculously long video about the boss fights from a single 4-year-old indie game, then thanks for the company, and I hope you can take away something interesting to think about. I realise I've done a lot of complaining, but hopefully it goes without saying that Hollow Knight is a game I truly love, and it's become one of my all-time favourites. I just want to repeat one final time that most of my gripes with the game's bosses will only show up if you dedicate yourself to beating them all on Radiant mode. That's because playing in a mode that demands a total mastery and understanding of each boss is a completely different experience to a more casual playthrough. Despite all of my gripes, I really would recommend the challenge of beating every boss on Radiant mode to anybody who loves the game. You might just be surprised by what you end up discovering. Maybe unsurprisingly, my final discovery is that I could not be more excited to play Silksong and find out what Team Cherry has in store for us in their next game. Maybe when that day finally comes, we'll meet again for another video like this one. For now, thanks for watching. Now get some sleep, you look tired.